The disciples of the Manhwa sect stood in perfect formation, ready to start another brutal day of physical training. One of the disciples yelled as he struggled to push himself up from the ground in a push-up position. Meanwhile, Chung Myung, our protagonist, stood on a boulder on top of a disciple who was begging for the training to end. He looked at the struggling disciples and said that no one had died yet, so they could keep going. The disciple struggled to complete another push-up, the weight of the rock and Chung Myung bearing down on him. The man screamed as he tried to lift the rock, and right on top of the rock, Chung Myung sat casually, watching the man struggle with a relaxed expression. But to understand how they got here, we must go back to the Great War that happened 100 years ago. Chung Myung stood there, covered in blood. All around, bodies were scattered on the ground. He realized that the only thing left in this place now was death. Chung Myung called out, "Sayong Jangmun." He looked up at the sky. He continued to call out, "Saje." The man's voice was weak, barely a whisper as he spoke. He thought of the Sajals, a disciple of Asahyung. The place was filled with blood and strange energy, a testament to the savagery of the battle. Chung Myung was impaled by a sword, his white robes soaked in blood. Despite the mortal wound, he declared that they were all dead. Over 20 different sects, including the 10 great sects, completely wiped out. The ultimate military unit, composed of the elites, was gone. Their clash with Chunma resulted in complete annihilation. He wondered whose fault this was, concluding that it was all because of one man. The heavenly demon sat atop a pile of swords, like some kind of dark king surveying his ruined kingdom. He was the demon sent from the skies, the leader of the group that turned the entire world into a bloodbath. The heavenly demon was a terrifying sight. He was pierced by countless swords, but he remained calm and composed. The heavenly demon spoke, his voice echoing with a strange pity. He said it was unfortunate for the disciple of the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung was covered in blood, his white robes stained crimson. Below, the battlefield was littered with bodies and broken swords, a testament to the ferocity of the battle. Chung Myung's face was a mess of blood and sweat. He was clearly in pain, but he still looked determined, even as blood dripped from his mouth. The heavenly demon spoke, his voice echoing in the silence. He said that if the disciple had managed to survive, he could have bragged about killing him for the rest of his life. The heavenly demon continued, saying that it seemed this was the end for both of them. And right after, a brutal hand clenched tightly, as if trying to hold on to life. The heavenly demon finished, saying that the disciple had every right to be proud of himself. His voice was weak, but there was a hint of respect in it. The heavenly demon, barely clinging to life, admitted that even with help, his opponent's sword had reached him. He then declared that in his name of Chunma, he acknowledged the swordsmanship as Chung Myung's hand gripped his chest tightly, trying to stop the bleeding. He must have been in terrible pain. The heavenly demon finished his sentence, saying he recognized the Manhwa sect's swordsmanship as the greatest in the world. Below him lay a battlefield covered in bodies and broken weapons. Chung Myung, covered in blood and looking absolutely furious, screamed at the heavenly demon to shut up. He looked like he'd had enough. The heavenly demon looked up, his red eyes burning with intensity. He spoke with a tone of regret, saying it was quite a shame. The heavenly demon continued, saying that if he were given another moment, he would have been able to become a man, befitting the name of Hua Mo. But he accepted that this must also be his destiny. The heavenly demon, with a final breath, warned the Manhwa sect's disciple to remember. His eyes glowed with a menacing light. The heavenly demon declared that this was not the end. With his last breath, the heavenly demon warned that the demons would return. His eyes burned with a final, hateful glare. The heavenly demon warned that when that happened, the world would be taken over by demons. The warrior's hand gripped the sword tightly, the blade glowing with an eerie pink light. He didn't seem to notice the blood dripping from his wounds. The heavenly demon continued, saying that no one would be able to stop them. The warrior's face was covered in blood, his eyes barely open. He looked like he was at the end of his rope. With his last breath, the heavenly demon whispered about the demons. The warrior stood amidst the destruction, his grip tightening on his sword. The heavenly demon stared forward, his red eyes burning with an eerie light. Blood ran down his face, but he didn't seem to care. And immediately, a massive explosion of pink energy erupted. The force of the blast seemed to shake the very ground. Chunma stared down with a cold expression, and immediately, a dark figure plummeted downwards, disappearing into the darkness below. Someone lay defeated defeated on the ground, unmoving. At the same time, another figure walked towards the body, their steps echoing in the silence. The scene showed a figure standing atop a mountain of corpses. The warrior seemed to be the only one left alive in the area. Chung Myung's face was covered in blood and sweat as he cried. He looked like he had been through hell and back. He stood there, gazing up at the sky, which was now glowing with an eerie light. The warrior seemed lost in his thoughts, trying to make sense of the devastation around him. He turned his head, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow. The fighter's face was streaked with blood, a grim reminder of the battle that had just ended. Chung Myung stood atop a mountain of bodies, a grim testament to the battle that had just taken place. He knew that every single member of the Manhwa sect had lost their lives in this place. Not only the members of the Manhwa sect were gone, but their followers too had been killed. The battlefield was now a graveyard. The only ones left were the powerless children, unable to defend themselves. The weight of that truth was crushing. The wind howled through the battlefield, carrying the scent of blood and the whispers of lost souls. It was a mournful song for the fallen. If only he had dedicated himself more to training, maybe he could have saved at least one more life. The thought gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his failure. Broken swords lay scattered across the ground, silent witnesses to the carnage. They were the last testament to a battle lost and a war that had ended in the worst way possible. Chung Myung lay among the dead, the bodies of his comrades surrounding him. He panted, realizing that all of this bloodshed was meaningless. Chung Myung's breath grew shallow, and he felt the life draining out of him. He thought that even a plum blossom bloom must come to an end at some point. With his last breaths, Chung Myung thought of the Manhwa sect. He wondered what would become of it now that everyone was gone. He was the 13th disciple of the great Manhwa sect, one of the 3 great swordsmen, the Plum Blossom Sword, Saint Chung Myung. After killing Chun Ma, who had brought destruction and disarray onto the world, Chung Myung's life was coming to an end. He breathed his last breath there, on top of the heavenly demon sect's mountain. The ground was covered with the bodies of the dead. Turns out, that short story was the only thing he left behind in the world. All the fighting, all the sacrifice, it all came down to that. But then, a baby was born, a new life, completely unaware of the brutal legacy he was about to inherit. At the same time, at the gates of Manhwa, the elders looked down, worried. Below, the sect was a shadow of its former glory. Despite that, the disciples kept training under the plum blossom trees. They were trying their best to keep the Manhwa sect alive, even if they didn't know its true potential. Above, the other disciples watched, but didn't dare intervene. Down below, someone yelled at Chung Myung, calling him a brat. Chung Myung was stunned by the outburst. He wondered if his life was flashing before his eyes. The authority figure lectured the 2 disciples, emphasizing that they should be an ascetic practitioner before a martial artist. He added that power without ethics can only be regarded as violence. Chung Myung looked annoyed. Someone muttered that he was at it again. He was sick of it. Even though he had been a disciple of the Manhwa sect, he hadn't followed its teachings completely. He was getting attention he didn't deserve because of his talents, but he was just a rookie in the Manhwa sect. He wondered why he hadn't realized that back then. He thought about how everything he had came from the Manhwa sect. Then, Jang Mun's voice echoed, asking if he regretted his past. Chung Myung admitted that yes, he regretted his past. Sahyung Jangmun. If only he had been more dedicated to following the teachings from the Manhwa sect, he thought. And if he could have become even a bit stronger than he was, he could have changed the ending of this horrible tragedy. Jangmun looked down at him with a sad smile, trying to comfort him. He told Chung Myung that there was no need to regret anything because the Manhwa sect would continue. The words hung in the air, promising that no matter what happened, the Manhwa sect would find a way. The mountains of Manhwa stood tall, covered in trees with pink flowers. It was a beautiful sight, full of hope. The words echoed again, stating that there would always be the Manhwa sect. It would never disappear. Chung Myung looked up, his eyes shining with a new resolve. He knew what he had to do. The small building stood quietly under the open sky, looking worn. Everything seemed calm for now. Someone reached out, shaking a figure awake. The voice shouted, asking about Chun Ma and how that could be possible since he was supposed to be dead. The person who was sleeping sat up, looking around with a dazed expression. He mumbled the name Chun, as if trying to understand what was happening. Standing over the sleeping figure, someone held a bamboo stick. He yelled that the other person was talking crazy in his sleep, calling him a bum. Now fully awake, the person sat up, his face still showing confusion. He asked why everyone had already left to beg, and what was going on. The man looked absolutely furious. He couldn't believe that he was being threatened after someone someone had the nerve to laugh at him. The man on the ground tried to calm things down. He asked the guy with the bamboo stick to put it down, saying he didn't understand what was going on. But the guy with the bamboo stick just laughed at him. He didn't seem to care at all. The man sitting on the ground was beyond confused. He started laughing too, saying that none of this made any sense. Chung Myung was getting angry. He was Chung Myung, one of the Plum Blossom Sword Saints, someone even the leader of the Beggars Union respected. And yet, this little brat was acting like this. The guy with the bamboo stick was beyond furious. He yelled that the man was dead to him, promising to teach him a lesson. And immediately, he swung his weapon down with full force. The man on the ground wasn't scared at all. He planned to block that slow swing, completely confident in his ability to defend himself. But something was very wrong. The defender's eyes went wide. He was completely confused. Looking down, the defender realized something was horribly wrong. He wondered why his arm was so short. What the hell was going on? He stared at his hand, completely shocked. He couldn't believe it was so small. It just wasn't possible. The defender realized he couldn't block the attack. His arm was too short to even reach. The attacker was beyond angry. He screamed that the other guy was a total bastard. The attacker didn't care if the defender understood or not. He was going to make sure he understood, even if it meant beating him senseless. The attacker shouted that everyone had a limit to how much nonsense they could take. He promised a good beating would knock some sense into him. Someone screamed in pain. It was a long, drawn-out shriek of agony. The attacker was on his knees, looking up at Chung Myung. He begged him to spare him, promising to come back later. He wiped the blood from his nose, making a sound of disgust. The beating had really messed him up. Sitting by the river, the attacker grumbled about how much he hurt. He couldn't believe he'd gotten beaten so badly, even back in the Manhwa sect. He called Chung Myung a damned bum brat, even if it was for the sake of that brat. He'd make sure to take care of the beggars of the Beggars Union. He was trembling with anger at the thought. Anyway, the attacker just kept walking, deeper into the water. He was probably planning his next move. Chung Myung stared down into the water, lost in his thoughts. He hadn't expected to end up in this situation, not after everything that had happened. He stared at the reflection staring back at him. Chung Myung wondered who this child was that he saw staring back at him from the water. Chung Myung touched his face, trying to make sense of everything. He asked himself what the hell was going on, and if this was the reincarnation that was mentioned in Buddhism. Chung Myung thought he would have entered the Shaolin temple instead if he knew this was going to happen. He was starting to regret his choices. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice someone approaching. Suddenly, a voice called out, "Hey!" The guy who had been getting beat up earlier approached Chung Myung, asking if he was okay. He explained that Wang Cho always acted like that, but today he had really gone too far. Chung Myung raised a finger, stopping him mid-sentence. He said that he only had one thing to say. Chung Myung paused for a moment, then raised another finger. Actually, he corrected. There were two things he wanted to ask. Chung Myung stared intensely. His eyes narrowed. The other guy looked back, completely confused by the sudden shift in mood. They stood there near the river, the sound of the water flowing around them. The tension was thick in the air as they waited for Chung Myung to speak. Chung Myung's eyes narrowed as he thought about his situation. He wondered aloud if he had really fallen so low as to become a beggar. The other guy looked at Chung Myung with a mix of amusement and pity. He pointed out that it was pretty obvious he was a beggar just by looking at his clothes. Chung Myung was shocked at the realization. He yelled, wondering how he could possibly be a beggar. Then, he quickly composed himself and said he had a second question to ask. The other guy looked even more confused. Chung Myung suddenly asked if he knew who Chun Ma was, adding that he had thought the guy was acting pretty normal for someone who had just been beaten up. Chung Myung's patience wore thin. He demanded that the other guy just answer him, calling him a bum. Then he sighed, calling him a bum again. The other guy looked up, thinking for a second. Then he said that, yeah, he knew who Chun Ma was. The other guy kept going, asking if Chun Ma wasn't the leader of the Heavenly Demon Sect. He added that Chun Ma had died 100 years ago, or so he thought. Chung Myung's face suddenly went pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was clearly shocked by what he had just heard. Chung Myung's eyes narrowed, his shock turning into something more intense. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Chung Myung shouted, questioning if what the other guy said was even possible. 100 years? That's insane. Chung Myung grabbed Jongmun, his grip tight. He demanded if it had really been 100 years since Chun Ma died, repeating the question in disbelief as he asked what Jongmun was doing. Chung Myung shook Jongmun, needing to know if all of this was true. Jongmun insisted that he was telling the truth, adding that there was no reason for him to lie. Chung Myung's eye widened, his mind racing. He just let out a trying to process everything. Chung Myung said that this was insane, repeating the 100 years in his head. He couldn't believe how much time had passed. past. Chung Myung wondered why he couldn't have been brought back right after he died. He added that this was almost like Chung Myung just stood there, staring up at the sky. He thought that he had been left all alone in this world. Jungmun looked at Chung Myung with concern, asking if he was all right. Chung Myung ignored the question, wondering how things could have gone so wrong, and if the Manhwa sect was also. Chung Myung's eyes darted around, his mind trying to catch up. He just let out a confused, "Huh?" Chung Myung's voice started to rise in panic as he asked about the Manhwa sect. He demanded to know what had happened to them. Jungmun stared at Chung Myung, clearly taken aback by the outburst. He asked what was going on. Chung Myung looked at the other beggar up and down, asking if he wasn't just a beggar too. The other guy just nodded, confirming that he was, just like Chung Myung. Chung Myung's face turned red with anger as he yelled, asking how the guy could be part of the Beggars Union and not know about the Manhwa sect, one of the 10 great sects. He demanded to know if the guy even knew what he was talking about. The other beggar tilted his head, completely lost. He wondered what kind of nonsense Chung Myung was spouting. Chung Myung started listing off the 10 great sects: the Shaolin Temple, the Wudang, Ashen Sect, Kong Tong Sect, Ching Cheng Sect, the Lotus Order, Southern Island Sect, Kunlun Sect, the Beggars Union, and the Southern Edge Sect. Chung Myung's eyes widened in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. There was no such thing as the Manhwa sect in the 10 great sects. It was like a punch to the gut. The message burned into his mind. The Manhwa sect wasn't part of the 10 great sects anymore, and immediately, Chung Myung's face twisted in shock. He couldn't believe it, asking how that was even possible. The news hit him hard, and his eyes filled with disbelief. The beggar stared at Chung Myung, clearly confused by what he was saying. He asked what kind of nonsense he was spouting. Chung Myung listed the 10 great sects. They were the Shaolin Temple, the Wudang, Ashen Sect, Kong Tong Sect, Ching Cheng Sect, the Lotus Order, Southern Island Sect, Kunlun Sect, the Beggars Union, and the Southern Edge Sect. Chung Myung was stunned as he heard that there was no such thing as the Manhwa sect in the 10 great sects. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The words echoed in his mind. The Manhwa sect wasn't part of the 10 great sects. It was a hard pill to swallow. Chung Myung's eyes widened in disbelief. He asked how that was even possible, completely shocked by the news. Chung Myung suddenly found himself being grabbed by the neck. He gasped, wondering if this was happening again. The beggar demanded, "The Southern Island sect? The Southern Island sect you said? Those country island bumpkins have become one of the 10 great sects?" He paused, then shouted, "Hold up, that's not what's important. The Manhwa sect isn't part of the 10 great sects anymore. The Manhwa sect." The beggar's grip tightened as he repeated, "The Manhwa sect." The beggar loosened his grip a bit, thinking out loud. He said that now that he thought about it, he thought he had heard that such a sect existed on the Shanxi province map. The beggar continued, "The Shanxi province map, right. It must be on the Shanxi map somewhere. Do you know anything about it?" He then admitted he wasn't sure about them being a part of the 10 great sects, but Chung Myung looked up, his mind racing. He was starting to get a really bad feeling about all this. Then the beggar said, "As far as I know, the Manhwa sect has already fallen." Chung Myung's face went pale. Chung Myung's eyes widened, refusing to believe what he was hearing. "It has fallen? The Manhwa sect has..." The beggar continued, "The sect that was one of the 3 most prominent sects in the world, along with the Wudang and the Northern Loyal family. The Manhwa sect has fallen?" Chung Myung screamed, unable to process the information. Chung Myung was left speechless. He was at a loss for words. Chung Myung groaned, clutching his head. He was really starting to feel the effects of that beating. Chung Myung sat up, still in disbelief. He shouted that he refused to believe it and needed to see it with his own eyes. Underneath him, the beggar looked down at him, clearly annoyed. Chung Myung clenched his fist, his knuckles turning white. He was determined to find out the truth, no matter what it took. Chung Myung shouted that he was heading to Manhwa. He didn't care what anyone said. He had to see it for himself. The beggar warned him not to go. He said that if Chung Myung didn't want to get beaten up again, he should just go back to begging. Meanwhile, Chung Myung just stared at the ground, lost in thought. Chung Myung yelled at the beggar to shut up, saying he was going to ask more questions and the guy better answer. But the beggar wasn't listening at all. He seemed lost in his own world. Chung Myung stared down at his hands, looking absolutely confused. He wondered what was going on with this body of his. Chung Myung looked up, his expression full of confusion. He asked what the name of this body was, hoping for some kind of answer. The beggar scoffed, asking why a beggar would even have a name. He said people just called them whatever they wanted. According to him, Chung Myung was Cho Sam. Chung Myung grimaced dismissed, thinking that Cho Sam sounded like a total beggar name. He then wondered about his age, guessing he was around 15 or 16 based on his skin. But how would a beggar even know their age? Chung Myung demanded that the beggar give him his name and the name of the brat who beat him. He asked if the beggar really didn't remember anything at all. The beggar finally gave in, telling Chung Myung that his name was Ku Chil. He added that the one who beat him was called Ku Pal, but they usually called him Wang Cho. Chung Myung just hummed in response. Taking in the information, Chung Myung warned Ku Chil to listen carefully. He declared that he repays favors twice as much, but he returns grudges 10 times as bad. Chung Myung told him to remember the name Chung Myung of the Manhwa sect. He promised that the next time they meet, he would return today's favor. Anyway, Chung Myung announced he'd be leaving now, and with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Ku Chil behind. Chung Myung turned his back to the beggar, ready to move on. The beggar watched him leave, probably wondering what to make of all that. Chung Myung stopped suddenly, looking around. He asked which way was the Manhwa of the Shanxi province. He didn't get an answer right away, so he sighed, looking up at the sky, and then he started running. He was going to get there on foot, no matter what. Chung Myung declared that he was running. He was going there by foot. He said that even in his past life, he didn't ride something as slow as a horse. Chung Myung's face was red and sweaty, but he kept pushing himself. And yet, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. He was already collapsing. Chung Myung cried out that he was gonna die. He was flat on his face, panting. Chung Myung realized that this body wasn't fit at all, and he was already tired after running for only a few minutes. There was no way it was possible. Chung Myung would probably pass out and die on the way there. Chung Myung was still lying there, completely exhausted. So, how was he going to get to the Shanxi province, you ask? Chung Myung was lying on the ground, but he was already plotting. He thought to himself that this was where the trickeries of the great Chung Myung were going to come into play. He started laughing like a maniac. Chung Myung was fired up now. He figured he just needed to train himself in martial arts. The others probably didn't realize how amazing this opportunity was, he thought. Chung Myung knew that even those who had reached the peak of their martial arts skill had regrets. They regretted that when they were younger, they should have focused more on the fundamentals. He started snoring though. He also knew that they regretted that when their sahyung nagged them to train, they should have at least pretended to. He remembered those days clearly, and they shouldn't have been caught drinking the liquor their sahyung hid away. Oh, Chung Myung told himself to disregard the last one, because it was delicious. He couldn't help but smile at the memory. Chung Myung was fired up. He declared that he could do this all over again. Chung Myung figured he needed to find a place where he could avoid the world as much as possible. He decided this spot would do just fine. Chung Myung sat down in front of the tree. He wondered what he should learn first. The wind blew through the trees as Chung Myung thought to himself. At the same time, he knew he had countless theories of advanced martial arts techniques stored in his head, and that every martial art technique and the history of the Manhwa sect resided by his side. A leaf fell gently from a tree above. Meanwhile, Chung Myung knew tons of methods of inner chi cultivation techniques, and that if he didn't limit himself to just the techniques of the Manhwa sect, the amount he'd learn would easily multiply. Chung Myung looked up, thinking hard. Of all the martial arts techniques available, he was going to learn one first. Chung Myung paused for a moment, then finally spoke. He decided he would learn equilibrium. What kind of martial arts technique was this thing called equilibrium? At the same time, a book with the word equilibrium was shown. Turns out, it was a technique that was thrown away very cheaply in illegal street stores. As a result, someone paid a few coins for it. Chung Myung looked serious. He explained that his reason for learning this cheaply sold technique was because it wasn't a cheap technique at all. The Manhwa sect buildings stood proudly. It was explained that equilibrium was one of the beginner techniques of the Manhwa sect, taught to every new disciple who joined. The explanation continued. Equilibrium might not make you stronger, but it perfectly cleanses your body, getting rid of all the gunk. It was a fundamental technique, so there was no need to rush things. He needed to take his time. He needed to build a strong foundation. Only then could he build a tower of inner body strength. He focused on his hands as the blue energy swirled around them. This was where it all began. Chung Myung stared at his hands, carefully focusing his energy. He knew he needed to make sure to precisely cleanse the energy absorbed from his surroundings. It was almost like fixing a small misalignment in a big fabric, strand by strand. He had to be patient and precise. Chung Myung closed his eyes and focused entirely on the task at hand. He could feel the energy flowing around him, ready to be molded. He needed to perfectly cleanse any impure energy, and if he gathered the cleansed energy into the dantian of his body, the energy started to swirl faster and faster, gathering into a bright ball of pure light. He could feel the power growing within him. Chung Myung felt a surge of power as he sat there, finally done. It's done, he thought, feeling a sense of accomplishment. He knew that this dantian would be the foundation that would open up a whole new world for him. He jumped up, ready to go. A small but firm energy would roll like a snowball and eventually become an avalanche. No one would be able to stop. Shall I run to Manhwa now? He wondered. Then he paused, confused. Huh? Suddenly, Chung Myung tripped and went sprawling. Oh, right, he thought, face-palming. He had already used all of his energy learning the technique. Chung Myung groaned as he lay on the ground, completely drained. Damn it, he thought, annoyed. Equilibrium didn't help at all when he needed to use his body right away. Far away, a middle-aged man watched with a knowing smile. Chung Myung, you, he muttered, his expression unreadable. The man cackled, enjoying Chung Myung's frustration. He told him that he sometimes just forgot to use his brain, and then told him to get lost because he was getting on his nerves. Chung Myung was getting desperate. How in the world was he supposed to get to Manhwa at this rate? Nearby, the marketplace was bustling with activity. People were buying and selling, and horses were being led through the crowds. On the edge of town, a man leaned against a wall, resting. He seemed completely worn out. Suddenly, a voice called out, "Brother! Brother!" The resting man woke up, startled. What? He asked, confused. One of the beggars pointed angrily, telling the other that there was a rookie beggar stealing all their begging money. The other beggar listened, annoyed. The beggar with the bun asked if that was true. He was clearly not happy about it. The beggar with the bun decided that they needed to teach the rookie a lesson, and immediately, the two of them grinned, ready to cause some trouble. The beggar with the headband spotted Chung Myung and pointed him out. He sounded excited to get started. The two beggars approached Chung Myung, ready to confront him. At the same time, Chung Myung was still sitting on the ground, looking down. One of the beggars yelled at Chung Myung, calling him a little brat and asking if he was deaf. Chung Myung just sat there, not moving an inch. Chung Myung looked up at the beggars, asking if they were talking to him. The other beggars looked at him with annoyance. One of the beggars scoffed, asking if Chung Myung had just spoken informally to him. He figured the kid must have lost his mind so young. The beggar said he didn't know who gave Chung Myung permission to beg there, but since he was young, he'd let him go unharmed. As he said that, the beggar clenched his fist, getting ready to fight. The beggar demanded that Chung Myung leave everything he had and get out of there. But Chung Myung just stared back at him, not looking scared at all. Chung Myung was just trying to eat, but he couldn't help but think about what he had just learned. It was a lot to take in. The other beggars lost it, yelling that Chung Myung had no shame and were those trash were even stealing his food. They demanded to know who he was calling a bum, calling him a little brat. Chung Myung stood up. As a result, the beggars looked absolutely shocked by his sudden movement, realizing this kid was about to cause trouble. Chung Myung threw rocks at the beggars. Right after that, he held his arm, feeling the strain of the movement. Chung Myung muttered that his dantian wasn't perfect yet, but he figured what he just did would be enough for now. Chung Myung told them that he had already gotten used to this body. He said this was pretty bothersome, so they could all come at him at once. The man responded that Chung Myung was weak and couldn't hit very hard. He hoped Chung Myung didn't mind being beaten a little and called him a brat. The man ordered them to go kill him. The others responded, saying yes sir, and charged forward. The attacker immediately threw a punch, aiming to take Chung Myung down fast. Chung Myung took the punch right to the face, staggering slightly from the hit. Chung Myung didn't waste any time. He punched the attacker right in the face, and the sound of the impact echoed through the air. The attacker went down hard. The other guys just stood there, stunned as their buddy crashed to the ground. Chung Myung stood over the fallen man, taking a deep breath. He declared, "I am," Chung Myung shouted, his voice filled with pride, "the Plum Blossom Sword, saint of the great Manhwa Sect." Chung Myung's face was red with anger as he pointed at the others. "You damned bums!" The three men kneeled on the ground, looking nervous. One of them spoke up, apologizing to the guy who'd just beaten them up. Chung Myung looked at the guy, confused. He asked why they were calling a beggar chief. He was starting to wonder what was going on. The man waved his hands, apologizing again. He didn't mean to call Chung Myung a beggar, but it just came out that way. Chung Myung paused, gathering his thoughts. He was about to ask a question, hoping these guys could help him out. Chung Myung asked if any of them knew the fastest way to get to the Shanxi province. He needed to get there as soon as possible. The beggar laughed, finding the question ridiculous. He asked why they'd be living as beggars if they knew the fastest way to get around. The beggars kept laughing, finding humor in Chung Myung's ignorance. Meanwhile, Chung Myung was starting to think he'd asked the wrong people. Chung Myung chuckled, realizing he was barking up the wrong tree. He figured he should try another approach. The beggars kept laughing, not suspecting anything. But at that moment, Chung Myung grabbed one of them by the collar, looking serious. Chung Myung leaned in close, his voice turning cold. He warned the beggar that they might meet again, hinting at something bad. Chung Myung got right up in the beggar's face, looking absolutely furious. He warned that if he asked about something, the guy better have an answer if he didn't want to die. Chung Myung yelled at them to get lost if they understood what he meant. The beggars didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled away as fast as they could, agreeing with him. Far from the chaos by the river, the mountains stood tall and silent. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. High up in the Manhwa Sect, Hyunjong stood by the window, looking thoughtful, and then he spoke, addressing someone outside, calling himself the sect leader. Hyunjong announced that this was Un-am and gave permission for them to enter. At that moment, the door creaked open. The messenger stood in the doorway, looking a little unsure. He reported that a child was asking to meet with him, but that it wasn't important. Hyunjong seemed surprised by the news. He asked who this child could be, and immediately, a young boy appeared, doing some kind of hand sign. Chung Myung grinned, looking up at Hyunjong. He introduced himself as Chung Myung and announced that he wanted to join the Manhwa Sect. Hyunjong stroked his beard, considering the boy's request. He asked if he was serious about wanting to enter the Manhwa Sect. Un-am stepped forward, looking nervous. He admitted to Hyunjong that he had told him they weren't accepting anyone into the sect anymore, but that Chung Myung was desperate to meet him, so he brought him there anyway. Hyunjong and Un-am exchanged glances, unsure what to make of the situation. The room fell silent as they both stared at the kid, who was still holding that weird hand sign. From the outside, Chung Myung seemed to be smiling innocently, but that expression was hiding something. Turns out, Chung Myung was actually very irritated. To find out why, we're gonna have to go back a few moments. The walking stick sunk into the dirt. It was clear he had been walking for a long time, and the journey had taken its toll. Chung Myung was crying, tears streaming down his face. He finally made it, muttering that he had arrived. He looked up, his eyes fixed on the imposing silhouette of Mount Hua looming above. He said the name of the place like a prayer. Chung Myung grumbled about the shortcut those beggars had given him. It hadn't helped at all, but at least he was finally there. He swore he wouldn't forgive them if they ever crossed paths again. Chung Myung looked down, steeling himself for what was to come. Well then, he muttered, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Chung Myung gripped the branch tightly, his knuckles white. It's time for me to climb the mountain, he declared, his eyes fixed on the peak above. He took the first step, then another, and another, climbing the seemingly endless stone stairs. He grunted with each step, his breath coming in short bursts. His feet pounded against the rough ground with each step, the climb relentless, and immediately he was panting, sweat dripping down his face as he struggled to catch his breath. He grit his teeth, pushing through the pain and exhaustion. I'll climb like my life depends on it, he vowed, his voice strained but resolute. His hand gripped the rough rock, searching for a hold. As a result, small rocks tumbled down the mountainside as he pulled himself up, inching closer to his goal. Chung Myung continued his climb, his movements causing rocks to break loose and tumble down the steep mountainside. The higher he climbed, the more treacherous the path became. He was bruised and battered, but Chung Myung refused to give up. He thought that anything was possible if he was tenacious enough. He dug his fingers into the rough rock, pulling himself higher. The climb was relentless, but he wouldn't stop. Chung Myung shouted, his voice echoing through the mountains, declaring that he would climb Mount Hua. Nothing would stop him. Finally, Chung Myung reached the top, standing tall against the backdrop of the setting sun. He had made it, and he was ready for what came next. Chung Myung was breathing hard, trying to catch his breath. He managed to get out a weak, whoa. He looked around, eyes wide with panic. Where did it go? Chung Myung's gaze went up to where the Mount Hua Sect's sign should have been, but it wasn't there. Chung Myung grabbed his head, his voice rising in disbelief. The thing Young Jung-mun cleaned every morning. Squeak, squeak. Where did that thing go? Chung Myung was losing it. He shouted that he was going to go crazy right there. Someone inside called out, wanting to know who was there, and right then, the door slid open, revealing Chung Myung standing outside. The man peered out, looking surprised. He wondered if it was just a kid. The man asked if Chung Myung had come there alone, and how he had managed to climb all the way up there by himself. Chung Myung replied that he had just climbed up. Chung Myung looked up, trying to catch his breath. He said he had something he wanted to ask. The man was listening intently. Chung Myung asked if he was a martial arts practitioner from the Manhwa Sect. Chung Myung looked up at the man, his eyes shining with determination. He declared that he was right. The Manhwa Sect hadn't disappeared completely. Chung Myung looked surprised as the man spoke. He asked if he could come in for now, then apologized. The man explained that they weren't accepting any outsiders at the moment, but he added that it was probably too late to start climbing back down, and they couldn't let a guest of the Manhwa sect climb back down in the middle of the night. The man at the door gestured for Chung Myung to come inside. He added that Manhwa got very cold when night fell. Chung Myung's face twisted in frustration, and he let out a silent scream. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Chung Myung stared at the dirt floor of the training grounds in disbelief. He demanded to know what happened to the marble stone floor and what was wrong with the place. Unam tried to calm Chung Myung down, explaining that they were merely pieces of stone. He added that they must have sold them when they were in a dire situation. Unam then tried to reassure him that the training ground was very spacious and nice, but Chung Myung didn't seem convinced. Chung Myung's smile faded. However, he had a feeling there was more bad news coming. Chung Myung's eyes widened as he gazed at the crumbling remains of what was once the heavenly golden palace. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Chung Myung pointed a shaking finger, stuttering in disbelief. He was absolutely floored by the state of the place. Chung Myung stared at the empty space, a puzzled look on his face. He asked if something was missing there or if it had always been empty. Unam confirmed that it was pretty obvious. He explained that palaces once stood in the empty lot. He knew it was bad, and he was asking where they all went. Hyunjong laughed, trying to brush it off. He said it wasn't something someone of Chung Myung's age would know. Hyunjong admitted that it was pretty embarrassing for a martial arts master to say, but he guessed it was a wound of glory, or some nonsense like that. Chung Myung tilted his head, confused, but Hyunjong quickly said it was nothing, sir. The sect leader gestured for Chung Myung to follow him. He said it was understandable, and it wasn't like it was their fault or anything. He just wanted to show him something. He added that they probably had it the roughest, trying to keep the sect from disappearing until now. Every step was a struggle. They arrived at the Yuyuan temple. The sect leader pointed to it and said that this one seemed to be intact, at least. The Manhwa sect was a martial arts sect, so the guests had their own set of duties. Every member had a role to play. The sect leader told Chung Myung to go on in and prepare to pay his respects to their ancestors. Chung Myung nodded in agreement. Chung Myung stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide. Something wasn't right. He had a bad feeling about this place. He looked around the temple and his face fell. It was empty. There was nothing there. He started listing the missing items, his voice rising in disbelief. The golden candlestick that was given to ancestor Daitong Hak by the emperor of the Jin dynasty was gone. The hanging scroll, written by hand by the ancestor, the gold plating decorations, all gone, just like that. And the paintings that used to fill the room were all gone. The place was completely empty, stripped of everything that made it special. Chung Myung's eyes darted around the room, and he looked absolutely shocked. He stammered, barely able to get the words out, wondering if there wasn't something else that was supposed to be there. Chung Myung frantically looked around the room, his eyes scanning every corner. He was looking for a flower, he said, wondering where it could be. Chung Myung turned to Hyunjong, his voice rising with urgency. He demanded to know where the flower had gone and how Hyunjong knew about it in the first place. He looked absolutely furious. Hyunjong watched Chung Myung's outburst with a thoughtful expression. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully before responding. Chung Myung was not letting it go. He insisted that there had been a flower, a plum blossom made out of some strange white metal. He demanded to know where that flower was. The man smiled and casually revealed that they had sold it. He seemed completely unbothered by the news. Chung Myung listened as the speaker continued, explaining that they couldn't find a use for it. Apparently, it didn't suit their temple, and they were troubled about what to do with it. But luckily, they found a merchant who was willing to buy it at a good price. The words hit Chung Myung like a physical blow, and he dropped to his knees. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. Sahyung Jong-moon looked down at Chung Myung with a sad smile. He confirmed the awful truth. The Manhwa sect had fallen, the white plum blossom of the nocturnal fragrance. It was one of the two sacred artifacts of the Manhwa sect, along with the divine sword of the violet dawn. This type of white plum blossom gave off a sweet scent at night, and it wasn't as showy as gold, nor as flashy as silver, but rather unpretentious. It was a sacred artifact said to hold the righteous spirit of the Manhwa sect. The news hit Chung Myung hard, and he exploded with anger. And these dumbasses sold it off, he shouted. Sahyung Jong-moon noticed that Chung Myung was on his knees and asked if he was all right. Chung Myung was starting to realize the gravity of the situation. He knew he needed to step in as soon as possible before they made an even bigger mess of things. He looked up at Sahyung Jong-moon and begged him to let him meet with the sect leader. He was desperate to get things back on track. Chung Myung looked up and yelled. He wanted to join the Manhwa sect more than anything, and with that, everything was about to change. Alright, so the story jumps back to the present. Chung Myung was standing there with the sect leader and another guy in front of Manhwa. The sect leader was saying something about him wanting to join the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung looked at the sect leader and confirmed that he knew about the Manhwa sect. He figured it wouldn't be easy to get in, but he had a plan. Chung Myung smirked to himself. He knew he had an entire scenario ready to go. He was going to make sure he got in. The thing is, Chung Myung was going to use the name of Chung Jin, who was lost in the middle of a war. He was ready to tell them the story he had come up with. Chung Myung's story was that Chung Jin fell off a cliff. Then a lumberjack found him and treated his wounds. It was all part of his plan to get into the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung's story continued, explaining that even though Chung Jin couldn't move right away because of his wounds, he still taught the lumberjack the Manhwa sect's martial arts techniques to thank him. And immediately, Chung Jin treated the lumberjack as his disciple. Chung Myung grinned, revealing his master plan. He declared that he, Chung Myung, was the lumberjack's descendant. This was it, the moment of truth. Chung Myung thought to himself that the best thing about this whole story was that he could set his own position in the sect. After all, if the lumberjack was his grandfather, then he'd technically be on the same level as the sect leader. He thought it was an amazing plan, if he did say so himself. Chung Myung smirked, thinking that he should be in a higher position than the youngsters. He was ready for them to reject him or ask him for a reason. The sect leader surprised everyone by saying he approved Chung Myung's entry to the sect. Chung Myung looked completely lost for words. He wondered what was going on, and all he could manage to say was, huh? Chung Myung was still trying to understand what he was hearing, but the sect leader interrupted him, saying that if he really wanted to join the sect, he should let him do as he wished. The sect elder was completely baffled. He reminded the sect leader that he had said he wouldn't accept any more entries to the sect, but the sect leader just brushed it off, saying he had changed his mind. The sect leader continued, saying that maybe this was their destiny. Chung Myung looked even more confused as the sect leader told the sect elder that they needed to show more suspicion towards strangers before accepting them into the sect. The sect leader finished, saying that whatever the reason this child had, he came looking for the Manhwa sect. He seemed to have made up his mind. Hyunjong smiled, saying they don't chase away a bird that has come to the eaves to avoid the rain. He added that they hand out food to animals who come looking for food in the winter. How could they deny a child who seeks entry into the sect so desperately? Hyunjong then ordered Unam to provide the child with a place to stay and prepare for the entrance ceremony. Unam agreed immediately, saying he would prepare everything right away. Chung Myung looked absolutely stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, and all he could manage was a disbelieving no. Someone started screaming about how their position was gonna be affected. They were plummeting downwards, looking terrified. The emblem of the Manhwa sect, a plum blossom, was displayed prominently. The sect was about to change forever. Chung Myung sighed, thinking he was gonna have to wear a third-rank disciple's clothing. He wondered what was happening with his life. Anyway, Chung Myung wondered what this place was. He thought he remembered this place being used as a guest room. It was strange to Chung Myung that this was a temporary place to stay for those scheduled to enter the sect. The Manhwa sect originally didn't have private boarding rooms. Those who newly joined the sect immediately formed a bonding contract with their teacher and stayed in their teacher's rooms. So, it meant that there were people staying in these rooms. Chung Myung paused, looking at the open door. Suddenly, a voice came from behind the door. Someone was asking who was there, clearly annoyed by the intrusion. The person's eyes narrowed, filled with suspicion. They were clearly listening intently, trying to figure out who was on the other side of the door. The door was flung open, and the intruder demanded to know who was peeking into their room. They accused them of being a thief, looking absolutely furious. The other disciples looked around, completely confused by the sudden outburst. They started asking what was going on and what all the noise was about. Gul was furious, yelling that the peeking brat had invaded his room. He asked why he had to go through such hardships. Suddenly, a loud voice boomed through the room, demanding silence. The person wanted to know what all the ruckus was about. The guy went on, saying it was still time for training, yet they were all causing trouble in the boarding house. He looked absolutely pissed. Immediately, the group bowed their heads, sincerely apologizing to Great Sasuk. They knew they had messed up. The guy asked who he was. Chung Myung told him that his name was Chung Myung. Great Sasuk told Chung Myung that he must be the newcomer in the White Plum Blossom boarding house. Great Sasuk told him to get some rest for the day since it was already late, and to make sure to participate in training starting tomorrow. Great Sosik dismissed the rest of the group, telling them to come back downstairs. They all replied, "Yes, sir." Jo-gul looked absolutely furious. He glared in Chung Myung's direction, clearly not happy about the interruption. Gul was furious that someone had been peeking into his room. He yelled that he would deal with the intruder later and make sure to teach him a lesson. Jo-gul just stared back silently, not sure what to say. Chung Myung just stood there, taking it all in. He figured he'd just have to deal with it. Chung Myung looked at the group, calling them the cute little successors of the Manhwa sect. He said that he would make sure to give them proper attention. Chung Myung smirked, adding that his kind of giving proper attention might be a bit different from others. He let out a little heh, as if he was planning something evil. He figured it was their problem, not his. Outside, the White Plum Blossom boarding house stood silently under the moonlight, unaware of the hell that was about to be unleashed upon its residents. Jo-gul stared right at Chung Myung, a strange smile on his face. He told him to take them off. Chung Myung looked confused, tilting his head slightly. He asked what he was supposed to take off. Jo-gul, surrounded by the others, didn't hesitate. He told Chung Myung to take off everything he was wearing. Jo-gul went on to explain that this was how men got closer to each other. He said they'd take off all their clothes, dance, get beaten up a little bit, and wouldn't that strengthen their affection towards their seniors? Jo-gul finished his weird explanation and stared at Chung Myung expectantly. He told him that if he understood, then he should hurry up and take them off. Chung Myung looked around at the group of guys. He had a question to ask. Chung Myung asked where the boarding house advisor, Eun-gum, was at. He added that the advisor didn't usually train in the afternoon. Jo-gul looked furious. He said that this little brat just couldn't stop talking. He changed his mind, deciding that they'd start with a little beating. Jo-gul stared down at Chung Myung. He told him to flex his neck muscles. Jo-gul cocked his fist back. He punched Chung Myung right in the face, sending him flying. The roof of the building shook violently from a powerful impact. The whole structure groaned under the sudden force. A crowd of people watched in stunned silence, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. What was going on? And immediately, the floorboards splintered as Chung Myung stood tall. The other students were sent flying, crashing to the ground around him. Chung Myung's face twisted in anger. He thought to himself, "Start with a little beating, you say?" The crowd of students recoiled in terror at Chung Myung's outburst. He screamed at them, calling them scumbags. The night air filled with screams of agony. The sound was so intense that it felt like the very sky was cracking. Suddenly, Chung Myung's voice cut through the screams. He called out, "Sahyung Yoon Jong." Chung Myung told them to put a little bit more effort into the massage. He said he was giving them special treatment because Yoon Jong was the great Sakyung there. One of the students replied that he would do his best. Chung Myung then turned his attention to someone else. He asked, "And you, Sahyung Jo-gul?" Chung Myung told him he wasn't going to hurt him, so he should come out. He looked absolutely furious. Chung Myung started asking questions, saying he still wasn't used to the situation in the Manhwa sect, and immediately, the subordinate replied nervously, saying that Sir Sajay could ask him anything. Chung Myung asked what happened to the Heavenly Golden Palace. He also wanted to know why the Manhwa sect was in such a mess. He looked serious, waiting for answers. The subordinate started to answer, but he was clearly nervous. He stammered, trying to find the right words. Chung Myung then asked if Sir Sajay knew of the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. He didn't wait for an answer before declaring that he was the Plum Blossom Sword Saint himself. The subordinate looked shocked. According to the Sasics, the Plum Blossom Sword Saint took a major role in defeating Chunma. The image of the legendary warrior loomed over the battlefield, a symbol of hope and strength. But after that, the remaining groups of the Heavenly Demon Sect went completely nuts and stormed into the Zhongyuan region. And for some reason, they forced their way all the way up to Mount Hua and set the entire mountain on fire. And because of the severe damage they took back then, they still haven't recovered the prowess they used to have. Chung Myung paused, trying to process the information. Wait, so that means the reason why the Manhwa sect fell is because of me? I hate my life. The elders had been discussing the Tai Yi Flummox sword technique, and it wasn't looking good. Turns out, the technique lacked Taoistic aspects and wasn't very powerful either. Gul didn't think it would be a problem to remove the technique from the Manhwa sect. He then asked Sajay what he thought about it. Sajay agreed, saying it certainly wasn't a sword technique that could be of any good use. He figured they should probably just throw it away, even though it was left behind by their ancestors. Another man suggested that, in order to prevent the children from taking an interest in it, they should just remove it from the library. That sounded like a good idea to everyone. They decided to do as he said and get rid of the technique. The conversation took a turn. Down below, Chung Myung was stuffing his face when he heard someone calling his name. On a different note, Chung Myung. Hyunjong looked at him, his expression serious. He said he hadn't called him there just to talk about about the sword technique. Hyunjong thought it was about time for Chung Myung to take in some disciples himself. It was a big step. Hyunjong then asked Chung Myung how he thought he should teach his disciples. It was a test of sorts. Hyunjong waited patiently for Chung Myung's answer. The air was thick with anticipation. Sahyungjong Mun looked at Chung Myung, trying to figure out what he was thinking. He asked what there was to think so hard about. Chung Myung didn't even look up from his food as he answered. He said he'd just beat them up first. Once he beat them to the brink of death, they'd make even the impossible happen. The room went silent after that. You could almost hear the cherry blossoms falling outside. And after that, Sahyungjong Mun never brought up the topic of Chung Myung taking in disciples ever again. It was probably for the best. Suddenly, someone called out for their Sir Sajay. It seemed like something was about to happen. Chung Myung was just starting to get comfortable when someone interrupted him. The subordinate stammered, telling him not to address him so formally. Sa-young. He corrected himself, calling him Sir Sajay, and then just Sajay. The subordinate explained that UN Gum, the boarding house advisor, had called him to the training grounds. He added that Chung Myung would also be participating in training starting that day. The training grounds were set. UN Gum stood on a raised platform overlooking the trainees, who were lined up in neat rows, waiting for his command. UN Gum's voice boomed across the training grounds. He yelled for everyone to prepare their blades. The trainees responded instantly. They drew their swords in unison, ready to begin their training. UN Gum roared at everyone to swing their blades. His voice was so loud, it felt like it shook the whole training ground. You could see the determination on the trainee's face as he prepared to follow the order. The trainees all swung their wooden swords together, yelling as they practiced. The sound of the blades cutting through the air filled the training grounds. Chung Myung watched the trainees with a strange look on his face. Beside him, UN Gum observed the training, waiting to see how the new recruits would perform. Chung Myung tilted his head, looking confused. He was starting to wonder what kind of training this actually was. Chung Myung watched as another trainee swung his sword, yelling something about hat. He couldn't help but ask what kind of sword technique this was supposed to be. UN Gum explained that the sword technique his Sahyungs were training with was called the equilibrium sword technique. It was the foundation for all other techniques of the Manhwa Sect, he added. One of the trainees practiced the sword technique. The wooden sword sliced through the air. Chung Myung looked absolutely shocked. He couldn't believe that was Manhwa's fundamental sword technique. What the hell are these dumbasses doing? He wondered. Chung Myung realized this training was doing nothing but hindering the children from getting stronger. It was actually making them weaker. Chung Myung thought this was like teaching them the alphabet using a complicated thesis book. The trainees continued to swing their swords, unaware of how bad their training was. The trainees continued to train, but Chung Myung knew that doing this might get them ahead for a short amount of time. A very short amount of time, that is. He wondered what good technique without proper fundamentals would bring them. It was like building a house on sand. Chung Myung thought that if they were doing it this way, they needed to at least try to teach them properly. Otherwise, this was just a waste of time. Chung Myung stared in disbelief. He looked absolutely furious. He looked up at the sky. Look how beautiful the blue sky is. The clear and cloudless sky is like the nothingness of the future of the Manhwa Sect. Chung Myung looked up, completely lost. He didn't even know where to begin with these guys. Suddenly, someone called out, "Sahyung." Jo-gul looked around, completely startled. "Yes?" The voice asked what else he was learning other than this technique. Jo-gul looked even more confused. Oh. The voice continued, explaining that after learning the equilibrium sword technique, they learned the sword technique of the 7 sages. And after that, they graduate from the Plum Blossom House and learn the Lesser Ching sword technique. Chung Myung closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. After learning all the basics, they were finally able to learn the sacred technique of the Manhwa Sect. Turns out, the technique was called the Tai Yi Flummox sword technique. Chung Myung looked completely lost and asked, "What?" The man then added that the Tai Yi Flummox sword technique lacked Taoistic aspects and wasn't very powerful either. Chung Myung, still eating, said that it was certainly not a sword technique that could be of use and they should probably just throw it away. Chung Myung suddenly yelled, reminding them that this was what they had agreed on. And yet, the technique they were learning was the Tai Yi Flummox sword technique? Are you kidding me? Chung Myung was absolutely furious and yelled, asking what happened to the 24 movement plum blossom sword technique and called them retards. Suddenly, a voice boomed from above, demanding to know who was chattering again. and ordering them to come up there immediately. The voice seemed to come from the main building. It was Joe Ghoul, looking back nervously. He mumbled that it was him, Sahyung Joe Ghoul. Joe Ghoul, trying to sound tough, told Chung Myung not to be so formal with him. He repeated, "Yes, Sajaya," in a less formal tone, trying to act like he was in charge. Chung Myung asked Joe Ghoul to do him a favor, but Joe Ghoul seemed a little unsure. He asked what kind of favor Chung Myung had in mind. Joe Ghoul then told Chung Myung to tell everyone to gather in front of the White Plum Blossom boarding house at 5 a.m. the next morning. He seemed to be enjoying bossing people around. Joe Ghoul continued, telling Chung Myung to also prepare the things he was about to tell him. He seemed to be getting more and more confident with each order. Joe Ghoul finished by telling Chung Myung to prepare 5 of those items per person. It was pretty wild seeing Chung Myung being ordered around like this. Joe Ghoul seemed a little unsure about what he was hearing. He asked if Chung Myung really wanted him to prepare those things. Chung Myung stared back at Joe Ghoul, a slight smile on his face. He asked if Joe Ghoul didn't think he could handle it. Chung Myung said he liked Joe Ghoul's enthusiasm, as expected. He then told Joe Ghoul that he could go now, waving his hand to dismiss him. Chung Myung watched as Joe Ghoul left the room. He had a lot on his mind. The system flashed a grim warning. Currently, the Manhwa sect had neither wealth, technique, nor talent. It wouldn't be surprising if the whole sect collapsed overnight because of that. Chung Myung thought to himself that out of all the things he could control, talent was one of them. He knew that the current third-class disciples didn't seem very talented, but Chung Myung continued walking, thinking that they did say 1,000-mile journey starts with a single step. He was ready to take that step. Chung Myung looked up, his eyes firm. He decided that bringing up these untalented Sayungs would be his first step. Outside the White Plum Blossom boarding house, the disciples were already gathering. They had no idea what was coming. One of the disciples yawned, clearly annoyed. He wondered what kind of Sajay made their Sayungs come and go as they wished. One of the disciples raised his voice, asking if the others agreed with him. He added that they probably weren't even in the boarding house last night. Chung Myung's voice cut through the air. He asked if he was the Sajay they were talking about. Chung Myung stood there, staring down the group. The air crackled with tension as everyone waited to see what he would do next. One of the disciples yelled at Chung Myung, asking if he didn't learn to respect his seniors. As a result, the other disciples braced themselves, waiting for Chung Myung to react. Chung Myung just stared at the disciple, his expression unreadable. He was thinking something over, but no one could guess what it was. Chung Myung's face suddenly lit up with a wide, innocent smile. He exclaimed, "Oh my Sayungs." Chung Myung bowed deeply, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. He went on, saying he was really sorry and that he must have been lacking in his understanding of his Sayungs. Chung Myung gestured towards the boarding house, his eyes gleaming. He suggested that as an apology, they should all have a little chat inside. Chung Myung put his arms around the disciples. He said, "All right now, let's head inside." The door slammed shut with a loud bang. The sound echoed through to the boarding house, cutting off the outside world. The disciples stood outside the White Plum Blossom boarding house, unaware of what was about to happen. At the same time, inside the boarding house, the disciples looked around, confused by the sudden commotion. The boarding house started to shake violently. It was clear that whatever was happening inside was putting a lot of stress on the building. The boarding house building was starting to shake, just slightly at first. At the same time, one of the disciples looked up, his eyes wide with shock as he realized what was happening. The shaking got worse. The whole building felt like it was about to fall apart. Suddenly, the doors of the boarding house burst open, and the disciples went flying out like they were shot from a cannon. They were all screaming. Ghoul turned to the other disciples, trying to keep things under control. He told them to be quiet, or else they'd wake the great Sasuk. Someone stepped forward, the sound of their boots echoing slightly in the quiet morning. It was time to get started. Ghoul grinned, his eyes shining with excitement. He announced that every morning at this time, they'd all be training together, addressing them as his Sayungs. The sun peeked over the mountains, painting the sky with the colors of a new day. It was going to be a tough one. Inside the building, someone was listening to the commotion outside. He wondered what all the noise was about. Ghoul frowned, realizing that no one had come to give their morning greetings. He sighed, assuming it meant everyone in the White Plum Blossom boarding house was still asleep. Ghoul started walking, his footsteps echoing in the quiet building. It suddenly hit him. There was a newcomer in the house. Ghoul figured they must still be asleep, especially after doing their strange rite of passage. He glanced through a door, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Ghoul decided he was going to teach them a proper lesson this time. He had been thinking that even if Joe Ghoul got a bit too wild, Yoon Jong would be there to stop him from going overboard. But clearly, that wasn't the case. Ghoul stopped dead in his tracks, a look of utter confusion spreading across his face. He didn't understand what was going on. The scene scene in front of the White Plum Blossom boarding house was a mess. Disciples were sprawled all over the ground, barely conscious. They were calling for help, some even mumbling for their moms, and great Sasuke, another disciple, barely able to stand, looked around in disbelief. He couldn't understand why everyone was in such a bad state and begged someone to save him. Suddenly, Ungum appeared, looking extremely concerned. He demanded to know what the hell was going on, his voice filled with urgency. Ungum's eyebrows furrowed as he noticed the disciples hesitating. He wondered what they weren't telling him. Ungum's expression hardened. What reason could they possibly have to hesitate in front of him? Ungum, the boarding house advisor. Jogul was completely out of breath. He looked absolutely shocked by what he was seeing. Jogul stammered, realizing something even more important. Behind everyone else, it was the newcomer? Chungmyung's hands gripped the wooden pole tightly. The muscles in his arms were straining with the effort. Chungmyung staggered under the weight, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was pushing himself to the limit. Chungmyung's face was contorted with effort, sweat pouring down his forehead, and right below, his legs trembled, barely holding him up under the immense weight. The rock fell from above, picking up speed as it hurtled towards the ground. The sound of its descent echoed through the air. Chungmyung struggled under the immense weight of the rocks, his muscles screaming in protest. He grit his teeth and counted. Chungmyung was at his limit, sweat dripping from every pore. He was pushing himself harder than anyone I'd ever seen. Someone called out, "Oh, great Sasuke!" And right below, another man looked down, thinking, "This kid." The voice continued, explaining that Sasuke was so worn out that his legs were shaking, and that was easy to see. His legs were trembling under the weight. The guy yelled for someone to bring Sasuke some water, right now. But then he immediately dismissed the idea, saying that wasn't necessary. After Sasuke gulped down the water, the man asked him to speak now that he'd quenched his thirst. What in the world just happened here? One of the disciples cried out, begging someone to save him from this nightmare. Chungmyung just smiled, saying it was nothing much. Chungmyung explained that it was just a little morning exercise they decided to do together. Since it was the first day, everyone must have been hyped up and pushed themselves a little too much. The man looked absolutely shocked, asking if they were really that hyped up. Chungmyung just turned around and walked away, leaving the man speechless. He didn't seem to care about the mess he'd caused. What was going on here? The man wondered why they were acting so scared of the kid. The man scoffed, asking if they really called themselves disciples of the Manhwa Sect, and yet they were scared of a mere newcomer. The observer thought he should probably give the newcomer a warning. The man confronted Chungmyung, asking how he dared. The White Plum Blossom boarding house had its own set of regulations. Meanwhile, Chungmyung just stood there, listening. The man yelled, asking who told him that he could sacrifice sleep time for training. He stared down at Chungmyung, waiting for an answer. Chungmyung suddenly said he'd stop. Then he looked up, confused. The man looked at Chungmyung, clearly not expecting that. He was probably wondering what was going on. The man's face turned red with anger. He decided to focus on the fact that Chungmyung had threatened his Sayungs. Chungmyung just smirked, seemingly enjoying the situation. He looked like he was up to something. The man hesitated, then said he couldn't do that. It would make everyone look like an idiot. The man thought that the third-class disciples were already idiots for letting a newcomer pressure them into training. He'd be the biggest idiot of all if he actually taught those idiots anything. Suddenly, the man paused, thinking about something. He spoke one phrase, 1 month. The man looked at Chungmyung and asked him to give them 1 month, calling him Great Sasuke. He seemed determined to prove something. Chungmyung smiled, full of confidence. He said he'd make sure to bring results within a month, no matter what it took. The man watched his Sahyungs training hard. He highly regarded their determination and respected them for it, since not a single one of them complained about the very demanding training session. The disciples looked at each other, trying to act tough. They all agreed that it was the right thing to do, even if they were scared out of their minds. Meanwhile, one of the disciples watched with a serious look. He figured that the others didn't dare to complain to Chungmyung, not that they actually agreed with the training. The disciple wondered where someone like Chungmyung had come from. He had completely taken control of the third-class disciples, but he intended to use that control for nothing other than training. The disciple thought it wouldn't be an easy task for Chungmyung. He wondered why he insisted on training every morning. Another disciple believed they could become plenty strong with Great Sasuke's teachings, but he figured they could speed up the process with more effort on their side. The disciple wondered if it made sense for them to sacrifice sleep for training. He figured Great Sasuke believed that there was no need for a reason in their training process, which was kind of insane. Great Sasuke asked what the most important thing was when treating their Sahyungs. The answer wasn't pretty, and it made him want to barf. dwarf? Turns out, the answer was courtesy. He knew that was important. Great Sasuke declared that he would regard his Sahyung's words as if they were coming from the heavens themselves. He was really laying it on thick. Great Sasuke wouldn't look down on his seniors. Instead, he'd keep his courtesy towards them to maintain the hierarchy. The guy was really serious about this stuff. One of the disciples admitted that Great Sasuke was the real deal. Below, the other disciples were running for their lives, clearly terrified. The disciples were completely under Great Sasuke's control. They were nothing more than ants beneath his feet. Great Sasuke told them that he was impressed with their determination to voluntarily participate in training at dawn. He was laying it on thick, but the disciples seemed to eat it up. Great Sasuke continued, saying that if they kept up these efforts, they'd definitely see great results. He told them to keep going, but then he paused, confused. One of the disciples looked up at Great Sasuke with a desperate plea. He begged Great Sasuke to save them from whatever hell they were in. The disciples were running for the hills, trying to get away from Great Sasuke. They were absolutely terrified of him. The disciples were begging for Great Sasuke to save them. They were in so much pain that they couldn't take it anymore. Great Sasuke told them it wasn't like he was going to kill them or anything. He suggested they all have a little chat back in the boarding house. The disciples looked absolutely shocked. They didn't know what to expect from Great Sasuke, but it probably wasn't going to be good. My dear Sakyungs, a few days passed by. Chungmyung sat cross-legged, completely still. A blue glow surrounded him as he focused his energy. He could feel his dantian, still small and weak, but at least it was starting to settle. It was progress, even if it was slow. While he was doing that, Chungmyung thought about what he'd learned about the Manhwa sect. Firstly, there was the White Plum Blossom boarding house. As he expected, it was basically a private dormitory. The boarding house had been thrown together in a hurry because there weren't enough people to form proper master-disciple contracts. Secondly, there was the sect leader and the Yun pedigree. Putting aside their personalities, they were weak. Their strength couldn't even be compared to the Manhwa sect from 100 years ago. Because their masters were so weak, the disciples were weak too. And on top of that, most of the third-class disciples had only joined the Manhwa sect to make friends. But Chungmyung was still focused and glowing with energy. He wondered why any of this would even matter. He knew that things were going to change now that he was here. After all, the great Chungmyung was back. Chungmyung tapped his foot impatiently against the floor. He was ready to get started. He looked up, his eyes full of determination. Becoming the strongest sect wasn't just a dream. It was going to happen. After that crazy training, the disciples tried to eat. They were all sitting at the tables in the dining hall, but they were so tired that even holding chopsticks was a challenge. The chopsticks trembled, unable to grip the food properly, and as a result, the poor vegetables slipped right off and fell back onto the plate. One of the disciples groaned, complaining that they shouldn't have to train so hard, that they couldn't even eat. He was clearly not happy about any of this. Another disciple shouted, begging Sahyung Jogul to say something to Chungmyung. He hadn't been able to use chopsticks for days, and it was driving him nuts. Jogul looked over at them, clearly annoyed. He told them they were talking too much, wondering what their problem even was. Someone started tapping their fingers on the table. They were clearly getting impatient, waiting for an answer. Jogul looked absolutely furious. He yelled, asking if they thought their Sahyung was their errand boy. The other disciples sat there, stunned by Jogul's outburst. He continued, asking why they didn't just go talk to Chungmyung themselves, since it wasn't like he was avoiding them or anything. Jogul lowered his head, trying to calm himself down. He knew he shouldn't have lost his temper like that. Yoonjong spoke up, asking if great Sahyung Sasuke could spare a bit of his time. He looked determined to get an answer. Sasuke agreed to speak with Jogul. The White Plum Blossom boarding house stood silently, as if waiting for what would happen next. They walked together through the garden, the cherry blossom trees providing a bit of shade. The air was calm, but the silence was heavy with unspoken questions. Sasuke turned to the disciple and commented that he looked refreshed. There was something strange in his tone, like he already knew what was coming. One of the disciples simply said, Sahyung, acknowledging Sasuke's comment. He seemed nervous, like he was trying to avoid the real topic. Sasuke asked what he thought of the Manhwa sect. The disciple hesitated, saying that it was a difficult question to answer. He was clearly choosing his words carefully. Jogul admitted that it would all be over for him once he decided to return to his hometown. But he turned to Sasuke, pointing out that he was planning to spend his entire life in Manhwa. Sasuke agreed with Jogul's assessment. Far below, the two disciples could be seen standing in the garden. Jogul confessed that he really thought the Manhwa sect was done for. He looked serious, like he was carrying a heavy weight. Sasek told him not to be so disrespectful. That wasn't something he should say so easily, he scolded. But Jogul declared that he had changed his mind. His eyes showed a new determination. Chung Myung, after he came here, things really started to change. It was like a switch had been flipped. Jogul admitted that even though they had been forced into it, he realized after the morning training sessions that he had never pushed himself this hard before. He was sweating like crazy, but he knew it was working. Sasek pointed out that Chung Myung didn't even seem tired, even though he was training way more intensely than everyone else. It was like he was built different. Jogul admitted that he wanted to try his best after seeing Chung Myung push himself like that. It was inspiring, even if it was also a little scary. The only sound was the soft shuffle of feet moving across the training grounds. The disciples were all pushing themselves harder than ever before, driven by Chung Myung's example. Yoon Jung stood there, listening to the other disciple. The air was still. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Jogul grinned, his eyes shining with determination. He declared that he wanted to try his best to become a master who could lead the whole world. Yoon Jong smiled softly, a hint of amusement in his eyes. He seemed to find Jogul's declaration amusing. Yoon Jong nodded, agreeing with Jogul. He told him that he shared his thoughts. Up in the tree, Chung Myung watched them. He seemed satisfied with how things were progressing. Chung Myung was laying in the tree, relaxing. He muttered that he had already convinced 2 people. Chung Myung thought that Eungum was also pretty easy to convince, but he knew that he still had a long way to go. Chung Myung was still up in the tree. He yelled for the sect leader to come out. Chung Myung looked confused. He didn't seem to expect what was about to happen. Someone was outside the building, banging on the doors. They demanded that the doors be opened immediately. A group of angry men stormed towards the building. They shouted for the sect leader to come out right away. The men were not backing down. One of them, holding a torch, demanded they get inside. He shouted, asking where the sect leader was hiding. The intruders pushed past the disciples, not caring who they shoved aside. One of the disciples tried to stop them, but they just yelled at him, asking if he had just touched them. Up in the tree, Chung Myung watched the chaos unfold below. He was surprised that they had actually broken through the gate of the Manhwa sect. He wondered what the hell was going on. The men continued to push forward, ignoring the disciples' protests. They yelled that they had waited long enough and couldn't afford to wait any longer. The attacker screamed, demanding to know when they would get their money back. He kept yelling, asking if they were going to pay them back at all. The air hung heavy with the unspoken question. Could the Manhwa sect really be in debt? It was a ridiculous thought. The sky seemed to darken as the words echoed. Could they really be in debt in this situation? The thought was terrifying. The mob outside the building was getting angrier. They screamed at the sect leader, demanding if he had no shame. They told him to stop running away and come out at once. The mob kept yelling for the sect leader, their voices echoing through the building. All that could be seen was the sect leader's feet, hidden behind the closed door. Outside, the angry men stood with their torches, waiting impatiently. Their faces were grim, lit by the flickering flames, as they waited for the sect leader to appear. Suddenly, Chung Myung's voice cut through the air, asking what brought them here so late at night. He stood above them, looking down with a cold stare. There's no doubt about it, he thought to himself. That man was indeed the sect leader of the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung's eyes narrowed, ready to deal with whatever came next. The sect leader stood there, radiating a sophisticated aura with every move and word. It was as if he was trying to act cool, but everyone knew he was just putting on a show. The sect leader was trying to act cool, but everyone knew he was just putting on a show. The sect leader was trying to act cool, but everyone knew he was just putting on a show. He was clearly trying way too hard. Someone from the crowd spoke up, asking the sect leader how he had been. The sect leader didn't seem too pleased to see them. The sect leader replied that he hadn't expected the pavilion owner Kong to come himself. Kong chuckled, saying he felt uneasy having to visit for something like this. Pavilion owner Kong started to explain that he didn't want to climb Mount Hua again if he could avoid it, but he added that many people had been asking him to come there, so he hoped that the sect leader would understand. The sect leader replied that they had to understand the reasons of these people, reminding him that the agreed date had already passed. He looked grim. Kong continued, saying that they had tried to understand the Manhwa sect situation multiple times already. He mentioned that if they followed the contract, they would be asking them to pay the price for violating the promised date, but they had been indebted to the Manhwa sect many times in their lives. Kong said that they would try not to be so harsh on them, offering them 7 days. He then warned that if they were unable to pay them back within this time, they would confiscate the temple of the Manhwa sect. He hiccuped. The crowd stood there silently. The threat hanging heavy in the air. The sect leader stared back at them, trying to figure out what to do next. Chung Myung was hiding, trying to stay out of sight. But then he heard the pavilion owner Kong say, "Looks like I let the child see something they shouldn't have." The building loomed in the darkness, silent and foreboding. So, what was going on in there? Inside, the men were waiting. One simply said, "Yeah." Chung Myung thought to himself that he was in trouble. He figured, who knows what he's gonna do to me? I should probably stay away. But then Sajay spoke up. "Isn't the Hua Prefecture the name of the village right below Mount Hua?" Young confirmed that was correct, adding that he remembered it from the days when he was peddling with his father. The disciple with red hair wondered if Manhwa Sect had borrowed money from the merchants. The other disciple admitted he didn't really know about that, but the disciple with black hair piped up, saying he knew about the pavilion owner Kong. He explained that Kong was the owner of the Tai Hua Pavilion of the Hua Prefecture. He added that he's the owner of the biggest pavilion of Hua and apparently a wealthy merchant who takes part in many different businesses. The disciple with red hair asked, shocked if he was hearing right. Was Kong really the owner of the Tai Hua Pavilion? The disciple with red hair started freaking out. The other disciple told him to calm down, but he just shouted, asking if he was really being told to calm down at a time like this. He realized that the Tai Hua Pavilion was originally owned by the Manhwa Sect. At the same time, his fist clenched tightly, shaking with anger. One of the disciples asked if the pavilion owner Kong was really trying to take the temple after lending them money. Another disciple confirmed that it was true, which made the situation even worse. But something didn't feel right. A strange feeling washed over him. The disciple with red hair said it was weird that the Tai Hua Pavilion, which used to belong to Manhwa Sect, was now lending them money. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The disciple with black hair realized that if something didn't add up, it probably meant things were going in the wrong direction. He felt a shiver run down his spine. Jo-gul looked shocked as someone called him. He stammered, trying to sound respectful. "Sahyong Jo-gul. Yes, sir? Yeah?" The voice ordered him to bring the thing he had mentioned before. Jo-gul looked confused, wondering what he was talking about. The speaker repeated himself, making it clear he wasn't messing around, and immediately, Jo-gul realized what he meant and shouted back, "That thing. Oh, that thing. I'll bring it right away." Jo-gul returned, holding a large bundle wrapped in cloth. He looked up, asking what they were going to do with it. The speaker began to explain. There's an old saying in Buddhist literature. As he spoke, Jo-gul and another disciple looked on, wondering what he was getting at. Chung Myung, dressed in strange clothes, started explaining the meaning behind a dark saying. He said that killing a Buddha or your forefather doesn't mean literally killing them. It means you have to abandon any attachments that get in your way, no matter what they are. Chung Myung continued, saying that if you meet a Buddha, kill him. He explained that to truly achieve the way of the Tao, you have to violate the way of the Tao. It was a strange lesson, to say the least. Chung Myung suddenly announced that he was off to find the true way of the Tao. Below him, two disciples looked up, completely shocked. One of them shouted, asking where he thought he was going, dressed up like that, calling him a dumbass. The disciple yelled, asking if he was thinking of leaving the Sect temple. He called Chung Myung a crazy bastard, and told him to jump, and without a second thought, Chung Myung jumped right off the wall. Chung Myung stood on a hill overlooking the Mount Hua Sect. The lights of the temple twinkled in the distance, but he didn't look back. He was gone, off to find the true way of the Tao, whatever that meant. Laughter echoed from the Tai Hua Pavilion, bouncing off the walls. It was a cruel sound, mocking the Mount Hua Sect. The sect leader looked completely shocked, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. They had basically given Mount Hua a final warning. The man laughed, asking how much the Mount Hua Sect thought they had borrowed. It was over 100,000 niang. He found the whole thing hilarious. The man said that the sect leader was even more bewildered because pavilion owner Kong was with them. He asked if that wasn't right. The merchant said that although he seeks profit, he felt sorry for having to do this to them. He said that after all, they had been in a good relationship for many generations. Taehua, pavilion owner Kong, said that they did the best they could. He asked how many times he had already let it slide. Taehua, pavilion owner Kong, said that everyone would praise his generosity. He said that he really hoped that was the case, laughing. Taehua, pavilion owner Kong, said that they were so carefree. He couldn't believe that they were able to live as such simpletons. Taehua, pavilion owner Kong, said that the power of the Mount Hua Sect was not something to be looked down on. The man said that the true strength of the Mount Hua Sect did not lie in their combat power. He warned that the biggest thing about the Mount Hua Sect to be wary of was their history. The guy was eating duck, and he was saying that in the Shanxi province, it'd be hard to find someone without any connection to the Mount Hua Sect. However, he took another bite, and he continued that these days, the Mount Hua Sect was significantly weaker. The guy then said that the Mount Hua Sect had become tender, just like the duck he was eating, whose skin ripped apart even with minimal force from the chopsticks. Pavilion owner Kong turned to the other guy and asked what he was thinking of doing with the temple after he took it from the Manhwa sect. He figured it'd be hard to sell, so the other man suggested that they just take something else from them instead. Pavilion owner Kong, sitting at the table, explained that the true value of their temple was beyond anything they could imagine. He seemed to know something the others didn't, and he was enjoying holding that knowledge over them. Kong continued, assuring them that even though the temple looked like nothing special, he could guarantee its true value. He let out a short laugh, then asked the other man what he meant by his earlier comment. He was playing games, clearly. Up close, Kong bit down on his chopsticks, looking annoyed. He thought to himself, damn idiots. And then he told the others that he couldn't tell them directly. Kong explained that they could use the Manhwa sect's enemies to their advantage. He asked how many other sects would be willing to spend a fortune to buy the temple, just to erase the Manhwa sect from existence. It was a dark plan, but effective. Kong finished by telling everyone not to worry. He promised that he would make sure they all got their money's worth. The others seemed satisfied with his explanation, but the whole thing felt pretty messed up. The others were really eating up what Kong was selling. One of them even slammed his cup on the table and said that Kong was a very smart man. Kong poured drinks for everyone. He told them to raise their glasses for pavilion owner Kong. Everyone raised their glasses. They all shouted, "Cheers!" together. Hours later, under the cover of night, a man walked away from the building, humming to himself. He thought this felt great. He figured if he managed to get the money back from the Manhwa sect, it would be enough to last him his entire life. He also knew that pavilion owner Kong was very thorough when it came to money. The man felt great, and the moon was so bright. But then he paused, realizing there was no moon at all. He figured it must be a new moon. He figured he should probably walk through the main streets on nights like this. He was really enjoying himself. Meanwhile, the man's drunken stroll was about to be interrupted. He started sweating, not feeling so good anymore. Below, shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, their intentions unclear. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. Suddenly, a figure in black appeared, standing silently in the night. He was completely covered, like a ninja from the stories. Suddenly, a voice called out, stopping him in his tracks. The figure in black looked up, startled by the sudden shout. The man stared at the burglar, completely thrown off by his outfit. He thought the guy looked like he'd walked straight out of a drawing, and he was also way too small. The man wondered if burglars usually wore such obvious clothes. He thought it was annoying that they were basically advertising their job to the entire world. Below, he asked the burglar if that was actually what he was. The burglar looked up, listening carefully. He said he wasn't interested in money. He just needed some answers, and he'd let him go unharmed. The man looked back at the burglar, a bit annoyed. He said it wasn't like he wanted to answer, but he didn't really have a choice. The burglar smirked, letting the man know that he had quite a few friends with him, you see. He seemed pretty confident, like he had everything under control. He went on to say that they didn't even let him walk around alone. Turns out, a whole group of men were standing behind him, all wearing similar hats and dark clothes. Someone watching nearby figured they must be high-class bodyguards. The guy's eyes were sharp, like he was ready to jump into action at any moment. One of the men wondered what they should do. He even suggested killing him, but another guy in the group thought they should at least hear him out and then capture him, making sure he could still talk. The burglar spoke up again, saying he wasn't a fan of violent scenes. At that moment, I was wondering what he was planning, since he was the one who broke in here in the first place. The man in green robes looked around, reacting to the sound he had just heard. He mumbled, "That's right." He suddenly yelled out, letting everyone know that the last hit seemed a bit too much. As a result, the face of one of the attackers was shown. The man in green robes stood over the burglar, looking down at him. He questioned if the others were listening when he told them to make sure the guy could at least talk. The man looked surprised, as if he hadn't realized the burglar was in such bad shape. He asked, "Oh, is that so?" The ninja stood over the bodies of the men who had attacked the Manhwa sect. It was a brutal scene, with bodies scattered everywhere. The man in green robes thought that people really needed to understand what others said to them, but there were some who just refused to do so, and immediately, the burglar was shown on the ground, beaten. The man in green robes called the burglar over, telling him to come closer. He was clearly setting a trap. The man in green robes repeated that if the burglar answered his questions, he would let him go unharmed. The burglar was scared and agreed. The burglar was caught off guard and shouted, asking what the hell was going on. He didn't expect to be attacked after agreeing to answer the questions. The man in green robes explained that if the burglar had just answered his questions when he first asked, he would have let him go unharmed. But since he tried to fight, this was what he deserved. The man in black clothes loomed over the burglar, who was still on the ground. He promised that he'd make sure the guy could at least talk. The burglar burglar tried to speak, but his face was so swollen he couldn't get the words out right. It came out as a slurred mess. The ninja warned him to fix his pronunciation before he hit him again, clearly not in the mood for games. The burglar, terrified, promised to speak clearly. The ninja asked if he was saying that he had loaned more than 100,000 yangs to the Manhwa sect. The burglar confirmed that was right. The ninja sighed, clearly not buying it. The burglar, seeing his reaction, looked even more scared and nervous. The ninja pointed out that even if he sold everything the burglar had, right down to his underwear, there was no way he'd make 10,000 yangs, let alone 100,000. The ninja wanted to know if he was claiming to have loaned 100,000 yangs to the Manhwa sect, which was supposedly collapsing. Trying to save his skin, the burglar stammered that he could explain everything. The burglar explained that it was just how high interest rates worked. He said if you loan money with a high interest rate, as long as they didn't pay it off, the interest just kept getting higher. The burglar continued that if you just gave it a little time, the interest became way higher than the original loan. Meanwhile, the ninja was trembling, barely able to contain his fury. The ninja struck the burglar hard, sending him flying. He shouted that taking money that way wasn't something to be proud of. The burglar coughed, blood splattering on the ground. He managed to choke out that he was also the owner of the fabric shop. He barely whispered, "Yes, sir." The ninja pressed the burglar, wanting to know when he had bought the fabric shop. The burglar stammered, pretending he didn't understand the question. The burglar insisted that his family had owned the fabric shop for generations, but the ninja didn't buy it, declaring that there was no way that was the case. The ninja explained that the fabric shop was one of the businesses of the Manhwa sect. He added that all the best businesses in the prefecture originally belonged to them, and that the development of the whole area was all due to the sect. The ninja continued that they had left the actual management to stand-in representatives, but those scumbags must have taken the opportunity to take over the businesses while the Manhwa sect was collapsing. The burglar interrupted, asking why he was being hit. The ninja looked absolutely furious. He yelled that the burglar was a scoundrel and prepared to strike him again. The ninja stood firmly, ready to fight. He couldn't believe he had been caught off guard like that. The burglar was furious. Judging from his skills, he doubted the ninja was just some nobody, so he demanded that he identify himself. At that moment, Jung Bin declared that he was the escort warrior, Jung Bin. He was sure the burglar must have heard of him. The ninja paused, tilting his head. He apologized, saying he wasn't really knowledgeable in those kinds of things, but he asked why Jung Bin wanted to know his identity. Jung Bin explained that he should at least know the identity of those who would die by his blade. He asked if the ninja didn't remember getting knocked out after he hit him just a few moments ago. Jung Bin was absolutely furious, calling the ninja an arrogant scumbag, and immediately he grabbed his sword, ready to attack. Jung Bin charged forward, ready to strike. He yelled at the ninja to brace himself. Jung Bin was confident, announcing himself as the escort warrior, Jung Bin. He was sure the ninja would soon fall before him. The ninja looked down, thinking that Jung Bin was definitely stronger than him in terms of pure strength. His inner strength, physical strength, and speed were incomparable to Jung Bin's. But despite that, the ninja didn't believe that made him weaker than Jung Bin. The ninja knew that pure strength and speed didn't define how strong one was in a fight. He was ready to use his skills to win. The ninja suddenly threw a bunch of swords into the air. They spun around like crazy, reflecting the light. The ninja and Jung Bin clashed, their swords meeting with a loud clang. The force of their blows sent shockwaves through the air. Jung Bin suddenly looked very confused. He clearly didn't understand what was happening. The ninja thought that he had the advantage because of his experience. After all, he still had his memories from when he was the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. The ninja realized that if he lacked pure strength, he just needed to borrow it from his opponent. He was ready to turn Jung Bin's power against him. The ninja kicked Jung Bin hard, sending him flying backwards, and immediately after, the ninja gripped his sword tightly, preparing for another strike. The ninja's eyes narrowed, focused, and deadly. On the other hand, Jung Bin lay on the ground, dazed and defeated. The ninja didn't even look at Jung Bin. He just told him to come back after training more. The ninja sheathed his sword, the blade sliding smoothly into its place. He was already preparing to leave. The sword clattered against the hard ground. The sound echoed in the silent space. The ninja looked down at Jung Bin, who was still lying on the ground. He suddenly realized that he needed to know something from him, but he almost forgot what it was. The ninja thought he had almost forgotten about Jung Bin. He suddenly remembered that he had accidentally revealed his sword techniques to the guy. The ninja wondered if Jung Bin had figured out who he was. He recalled that he even drew the plum blossom flower buds, so Jung Bin must have figured it out, right? The ninja realized realized that Jungbin had a polished and beautiful sword technique and a high level of martial arts. But most of all, Jungbin could faintly sense the pure chi emitting from him. The ninja thought that this was really bad. The injured man, his face swollen and bruised, asked if the ninja was from the Southern Edge sect. Huh? He mumbled, barely able to speak through the pain. The ninja stood among the fallen bodies, the silence broken only by the wind. It was a grim reminder of the deadly efficiency he possessed. The ninja's eyes widened as he realized the injured man might have figured out his identity. And immediately, the injured man exclaimed, "That's right! Chung Myung, level 15, Southern Edge sect! I knew it." The injured man, desperate to save himself, offered to answer any questions the ninja had. "Please, ask me anything. I will answer everything to the best of my abilities." Yeah, alright, thanks, I guess. The building loomed above, casting a long shadow over the scene. Something felt off, like a storm was brewing. Joe Ghoul was getting anxious, tapping his foot impatiently. "What's taking him so long?" he asked, clearly worried. But Sa-young tried to calm him down, telling him to just relax. Joe Ghoul was still worried, but Sa-young tried to reassure him. "But Sa-young," Joe Ghoul protested. But Sa-young insisted that he knew Chung Myung wasn't an idiot and could handle himself. Sa-young looked at Joe Ghoul with confidence. He said that Chung Myung would be back, sooner or later, so there was no need to worry. Sa-young's face turned to worry. He muttered that as long as Chung Myung didn't get into an accident, everything would be fine. The door creaked open, breaking the silence. It sounded like someone had just arrived, but who was it? The door swung open with a bang, and Chung Myung walked in, looking around. "Did anything happen while I was out?" he asked, his voice loud. "Sajay!" He didn't wait for an answer, but walked right in. The door creaked open wider as someone else entered the room. Yoon Jong and Joe Ghoul turned to look at Chung Myung, a little surprised. "That's something we should be asking you," Yoon Jong said, sounding calm. "Did anything important happen outside?" Joe Ghoul added that not much had happened. Chung Myung smirked, holding up his hand to show off a few coins. "I was treated very well," he said, sounding pleased with himself. "And I even got some spare change on top of that." Suddenly, a man with puffed up cheeks and a suspicious look on his face spoke up. "Are you from the Southern Edge sect?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. "Huh?" Chung Myung thought it was probably a good thing that the guy couldn't figure out who he was. Still, it left a bitter taste in his mouth. The plum blossom sword techniques were lost, so it wasn't the symbol of the Manhwa sect anymore. Even so, Chung Myung thought that Jongsan Yu, who had lived his entire life in the Hwa-Um prefecture, couldn't think of the Manhwa sect after seeing his sword technique. Joe Ghoul asked Chung Myung what he had been doing outside of the temple. Chung Myung said it wasn't something a child like him should know about. Joe Ghoul pointed out that Chung Myung was also a child. Chung Myung brushed it off and told him to gather everyone, because they needed to train now. Joe Ghoul looked surprised and asked if they were really going to train again, since they had just gotten back. He seemed tired already. Chung Myung, looking serious, told Sa-young to listen up carefully. He was about to make a big announcement. Chung Myung declared that, starting that day, they wouldn't miss a single day of training, no matter what. He shouted that even if the Manhwa sect fell, they wouldn't take a single day off. Joe Ghoul, all fired up, said he was ready for this and would gather everyone right away. But then Chung Myung casually said he wouldn't be participating that day because he had something else to do. Sajay pointed out that the training session was only possible when Chung Myung was there. It seemed like they relied on him way more than he let on. Joe Ghoul pointed out that they could train on their own that day, but he also mentioned that if they really wanted the other disciples to try hard, Chung Myung needed to show up too. He added they should just look at his face to see how tired he was. Then Yoon Jong said they were heading out. Joe Ghoul agreed and waved goodbye, saying they'd see him later. Chung Myung was now alone. He flopped onto the bed with a clearly exhausted. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. Then he started thinking about what he should do next, since the situation was, he remembered that the stand-in representatives had taken over the businesses. It looked like they were settling in. The account books that could have proven Manhwa sect's ownership of the businesses had been burned down by the Heavenly Demon Sect members, along with Manhwa itself. After all, there was no way any of this would have happened if the account books were still around. Chung Myung wondered if he should just assault them and wipe out all the merchants. He imagined himself doing it, cutting down the merchants in a rage. Chung Myung was lying down, thinking about the situation. He decided he shouldn't give in to violence, because everyone would think the Manhwa sect pushed a small child into wrongdoing, so he just needed an excuse. He needed an excuse for the Manhwa sect to not pay back the merchants options, and he needed evidence to prove that the businesses were originally owned by the Manhwa sect. But the problem was that Chung Myung didn't know where to find the excuses and evidence. He lay there, frustrated by the lack of options. Chung Myung was still lying there, lost in thought. The silence was only broken by the sound of his own breathing. Then it hit him. He suddenly remembered the account book. Come to think of it, he thought, I remember seeing Sahyung Jang-moon write in it a few times. He then remembered that whenever he came in, Jang-moon would hide a few volumes of the account books they had. The guy was always acting sneaky. He paused, his eyes widening. He was onto something. He could feel it. He sat up, his mind racing. Were there only a few volumes of those books? He suddenly had a bad feeling about this. Chung Myung's eyes went wide. He realized that Jang-moon must have hidden the rest of the account books somewhere else. There was no way that Manhwa sect only had a few volumes of account books when they managed so many businesses. The secret storage, which only the sect leader could enter, that's where the account books must be. Sahyung must have put them there. He'd heard a few rumors about it before. If there really was a secret storage, then its entrance was most likely inside the sect leader's residence. Chung Myung needed to think. The sect leader's residence hadn't changed from the past. It was somewhere in Manhwa, where many martial art masters resided, and was hidden somewhere close to the sect leader's residence. Chung Myung stared intently at the hills behind the sect leader's residence. That had to be it. He figured the storage must be underground. If they built it under the hills, there was no way anyone could ever figure out where it was. Chung Myung smiled, ready to start some unprecedented treasure hunting. He was gonna find those books, no matter what. He quietly slid open a window, slipping into the sect leader's residence. He had to be sneaky about this. Chung Myung jumped from the building, already apologizing to Sahyung Jang-moon in his head. After all, saving the Manhwa sect had to be his first priority, right? The ninja thought to himself that he'd hand it over to the sect leader without getting his hands on it, if he could. And immediately, he started running across the roof, heading towards his target. Meanwhile, Chung Myung was running with a stick over his shoulder, a huge smile on his face. He was gonna find those books, no matter what it took. Chung Myung thought to himself that he'd hand it over to the sect leader without getting his hands on it, if possible, that is. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist. The air was still, and the silence was broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks. Suddenly, Chung Myung lost his footing and started falling backwards. He shouted that he was gonna die. Chung Myung sat at the bottom of the small hill, catching his breath. He muttered to himself that it might be a small hill, but it was still the same as searching an entire mountain, which was no easy task. Chung Myung looked annoyed. Even when he did it this way, it was still a pain. Chung Myung sat down and put his hands together, focusing his energy, and immediately, a blue light started glowing from his hands, swirling with power. Chung Myung focused, his hands glowing with a bright blue light. He channeled his energy, hoping this would lead him to the hidden storage room. Chung Myung watched as the beam shot out from his hands, piercing through the ground. He thought that if the energy met a large, empty space, that would be the storage room. Chung Myung stared at the ground, a question mark hanging in the air. He said that was what he thought, and he didn't know where it was, but there was no other reason for the empty space to be in the ground there. Chung Myung fell back, exhausted and frustrated. He exclaimed that he was gonna die, and it was probably not there. Chung Myung looked up, his eyes filled with determination. He decided to screw it and try one more time. Chung Myung gasped for air, his lungs burning. He wasn't gonna give up just yet. He had to try one more time. Chung Myung focused his energy again, sending a beam of light into the ground. But as the light pulsed, Chung Myung looked confused, not understanding what was happening. The beam of energy shot down into the earth, creating a ripple effect. And immediately, Chung Myung realized what it meant. He had found it. Chung Myung shouted that he had found it. And immediately, he grabbed a pickaxe, ready to dig into the ground. Chung Myung knew he needed to dig to confirm what he had found with his own eyes. With a grunt, he swung the pickaxe down, the sound echoing in the room. Chung Myung stared at the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel that he was close to finding what he'd been searching for. Chung Myung looked absolutely shocked. Bricks? He wondered if this was really Manhwa's secret storage. There was no way it could be made out of just bricks, not with all of Manhwa's treasures and account books supposedly hidden inside. He reached out and touched the bricks, feeling around the edges, and immediately, his eyes widened as he looked into the hole he had created. A grin spread spreading across his face, saying it was nice. A dark hallway stretched out before him, promising secrets and hidden treasures. Chung Myung shouted that he found the hallway that led to the secret storage. Chung Myung stared down the hallway, a mix of excitement and nervousness swirling within him. He wondered what secrets and dangers awaited him in the depths of the secret storage. Chung Myung stood in the hallway, deep in thought. He wondered if the sect leader knew about the hidden safe. If he did, that could complicate things. Chung Myung walked further down the hallway and reached out to touch the wall. He ran his fingers along the cold, rough surface, searching for any sign of a hidden door or mechanism. Chung Myung's eyes landed on a door at the end of the hallway. He wondered if the scratch door was the entrance to the secret storage. It definitely looked like it had been through a lot. Chung Myung approached the door cautiously, his hand hovering over the surface. But what was he doing? He couldn't figure it out. Chung Myung stared at the door for a long moment. Then it hit him. He wasn't trying to do anything. He was just standing there, observing. Chung Myung stared at the door, thinking about the sect leader. He knew that the sect leader was just a man who couldn't do anything as Manhwa fell apart. The study of martial arts was declining, and the wealth of the sect was decreasing. Leading Manhwa in a situation like this had to be a depressing task for the sect leader. How would it feel to watch Manhwa, the place you've spent your entire life protecting, fall apart without being able to do anything to stop it? Chung Myung wondered about that, but the sect leader couldn't tell anyone about that feeling. He had to keep it all inside, hidden from everyone else, because the sect leader is someone the disciples can lean on, and therefore, he had to hide his own pain and be strong for them. He was a man who endured the pain and sadness all alone in places like this, far from the eyes of his disciples. He carried the weight of Manhwa on his shoulders, a burden he couldn't share with anyone. The sound of crumbling stone echoed through the chamber. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the debris as he walked towards the hole in the wall. He stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint sound of his own breathing. Chung Myung stood there, his hand resting against the cold stone wall. He realized that he was at fault for what had happened to Manhwa. He looked up, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. It wasn't too late to fix things. He could still save Manhwa. Chung Myung stood before the massive door, ready to get it open. He muttered that he was going to swing the damn thing open first. He pressed his hand against the cold, hard wood of the door. The silence was heavy, filled with anticipation. Chung Myung began to channel his energy, a faint blue glow surrounding his hand. He focused all of his power into the ancient door, hoping it would respond. The energy surged around him, crackling with raw power. The air vibrated as he unleashed the full force of his technique, but the energy just bounced right off the door, leaving Chung Myung completely shocked. He wondered what the hell was going on. Chung Myung stared at the door in disbelief. He realized it was made of the everlasting metal, and it was at least a foot thick. He thought that the secret storage would be made out of the strongest metal in the world, said to be even more expensive than gold. Chung Myung knew that something this size would take the strongest master in the world to barely cut through it. That's why the sect leader didn't even try to open it, he figured. The problem was, even Chung Myung couldn't open this. He was starting to feel like he was in over his head. Chung Myung looked around the room, trying to figure out another way to get through the door. He was determined to find a solution, no matter how difficult it seemed. If only he could find that way. Then, Chung Myung noticed something on the wall. He wondered what it was. Chung Myung carefully examined the pattern on the wall. He wondered what it could be. Then it hit him. Chung Myung realized that the patterns weren't just decorations. They were blade marks. Chung Myung stared intently. Some of the marks resembled the movement plum blossom sword technique. He was starting to piece things together. He looked closer. This one was the bamboo leaf sword technique, and that one was the equilibrium sword technique. Now that he knew they were blade marks, Chung Myung started to recognize them for what they were. Chung Myung's eyes widened. If these were the clues on how to open the door, he was finally on the right track. Chung Myung realized what he was dealing with. Turns out, it was the Violet Dawn fortified chi. Chung Myung planned it out. He'd follow the marks precisely, starting with the equilibrium sword technique and the bamboo leaf sword technique. Then he'd move on to the 24 movement plum blossom sword technique, and finally bring out the plum blossom sword dance. That's how he'd open the door. He wondered how anyone could make something like this. Anyway, Chung Myung felt like he got the gist of it. He could see the complex patterns of the door right in front of him. That meant there was just one problem left. Chung Myung wondered how he was supposed to perform all those techniques. It would have been no problem if it was his past self. However, now Chung Myung was nothing but a child. He could play it all in his head, but applying inner strength to his blade and instantly performing those techniques was currently impossible for him. Chung Myung realized there was still a way, but he really didn't want to do it. He could already feel the exhaustion creeping in. He focused his energy. His hands started to glow with a bright, unnatural light as he started to gather his innate, true chi. Chung Myung figured he'd just take a break for about a month, maybe longer. He knew this would take a lot out of him. He told himself he'd only use a little bit of it, just a little bit of his innate true chi. He really hoped that would be enough. Chung Myung released the energy. A bright light surrounded his body as he started to perform the sword techniques. The innate true chi. It's something everyone has since they're born. It's the energy that keeps you alive. Basically, it's a life force. Chung Myung knew that if he used it, he'd have to brace himself for the consequences, but he didn't have a choice right now. Chung Myung was surrounded by a bright purple light as he performed the sword techniques. He had to focus all of his energy. The sword glowed with an unnatural light as Chung Myung poured his energy into it, but at the same time, he spat out blood, feeling the strain on his body. Chung Myung wasn't sure if it was even possible, but he told himself it had to be. He figured his body was just acting weird because it wasn't used to stuff like this. He stomped down hard, knowing there was no turning back now. Chung Myung declared that there were no second chances. He swung the sword with all his might, the blade cutting through the air. The purple aura of innate true chi swirled around him as he focused on the task at hand. Blood trickled from Chung Myung's mouth as he pushed his body to its absolute limit. At the same time, his hand trembled as he gripped the sword, feeling the immense strain on his muscles. He refused to give in, clenching his fist so hard that his knuckles turned white. Chung Myung knew he was close, and he wouldn't let his body betray him now. Chung Myung took another step forward, ignoring the pain and exhaustion. He wouldn't stop, no matter what it took. The sword moved so fast, it was almost impossible to see. The blade danced between the equilibrium sword technique and the bamboo leaf sword technique. He didn't stop there. From the bamboo leaf sword technique, he transitioned into the movement plum blossom sword technique. Not a single pause. Chung Myung's face was a mask of concentration as he channeled his energy. The air crackled around him, the intensity building with each movement. He roared, declaring that he was the plum blossom sword saint. The words echoed through the room, filled with power. With a final surge of energy, Chung Myung completed the sequence. The sword moved in a blur, cutting through the air with incredible force. Chung Myung coughed, spitting out blood. He had pushed himself too hard, and his body was starting to feel the strain. He collapsed to the ground, panting. The residual energy from the sword technique swirled around him, a chaotic reminder of the power he had just unleashed. Blood stained the floor, each drop a testament to the effort he had put into that final strike. It was a grim reminder of what it took to unlock this secret. Chung Myung pushed himself up, his face pale and streaked with blood. Did it work? He asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and anticipation. He stared at the door, his heart pounding. It would be devastating if it still wasn't opened after all that, he thought to himself. The power of the sword technique began to condense, swirling into a vortex of pure energy. It was a dangerous amount of power to contain in such a small space. The energy exploded outwards, shaking the entire room, and immediately, Chung Myung was left staring blankly, totally confused by what was happening. Chung Myung's eyes widened in shock. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, his face frozen in disbelief. The sound of stone grinding against stone echoed through the chamber as the door began to crack open. Chung Myung looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. The door swung open, revealing the hidden chamber beyond. Chung Myung grinned, finally able to see the results of his efforts. It opened, he thought. Chung Myung's face was all puffed up as he tried to cough. He could feel blood trickling down his face, a grim reminder of the power he had just unleashed. The floor was now covered in blood, splattered everywhere from the force of the blast. It was a messy scene, to say the least. Chung Myung coughed again, more blood coming up. He was clearly in a lot of pain, his body taking a beating from using all that power. Chung Myung sat there on the floor, beat. He figured he'd be stuck in bed for at least 2 months now, not just one. Saving the Manhwa Sect was such a pain in the butt, he thought. He slowly got to his feet, ignoring the pain, and as he stood up, Chung Myung gripped his sword tightly, ready to face whatever was next. Chung Myung wiped the blood from his mouth. His eyes narrowed with determination. He wasn't about to let a little pain stop him from getting to the bottom of this. Chung Myung glanced down, a glint of curiosity in his eyes. He wondered what kind of secrets Seung Jongmun had been hiding all this time. Shall I take a look at what Seung Jongmun's been hiding? He thought. Chung Myung didn't hesitate. He gathered all his power and slammed it into the door, the force causing cracks to appear all around it. The entire structure shook as he forced it open. Chung Myung stepped into the room. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. Chung Myung looked around, but there were only 3 bookshelves. It's smaller than I thought, he muttered, clearly disappointed. Chung Myung figured it made sense, though. He thought that making a huge safe out of everlasting metal would only be possible for the greatest sect in the world. Chung Myung remembered how Sa-young kept complaining about how they had no money. He guessed Sa-young had used all of it to make this storage room. Chung Myung reached out and grabbed a book, his eyes widening in surprise. What the hell was this? Chung Myung's eyes lit up as he held the books. He shouted that he had found them, the account books of the Manhwa sect. The pages were filled with meticulous records. It looked like Sa-young had even made copies of the originals from the Finance and Economy Agency. Such a thorough man. This would definitely do. Chung Myung pumped his fist, declaring that the damn merchants were all doomed now. But now that he thought about it, Chung Myung squinted, looking at the shelves. He wondered if there were really only papers in here. Chung Myung began rummaging through the bookshelves, clearly looking for something else. He complained that if Sa-young had hidden away some money, he could have used it for the greater good. He grumbled that aside from returning prosperity to the Manhwa sect, he would have eaten meat and drunk alcohol to his heart's content. He was disappointed that the nasty old man really did not hide any money here. Chung Myung sighed, wondering what he had even expected from Sa-young. He figured he would just look through the papers, wondering what the old man had put on the second shelf. Chung Myung's eyes widened as he found a secret technique book. He wondered if it had been used before. He paused, taking a closer look. Chung Myung realized that these techniques hadn't been used before. These were martial arts technique books that had been practically abandoned by the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung thought about Sa-young Jang-moon. He figured the old man probably couldn't bring himself to completely abandon the martial arts techniques they decided not to pass on to future generations. He must have stored them in here because he thought throwing them away might negatively impact the Manhwa sect in the future. Chung Myung thought. Sa-young really couldn't let go of the past. The first bookshelf signified the duties of the Manhwa sect leader. The second shelf must signify the sect leader's personal attachments and affections to the Manhwa sect. Chung Myung grabbed a book tightly. He promised Sa-young that he would make sure to bring the Manhwa sect back to its place. Not only that, Chung Myung thought, he'd even make it stronger than it ever was. He looked absolutely determined to do it. Chung Myung turned to the third bookshelf, looking to see what was on it. He was searching for something. Chung Myung asked if the scroll was the only thing on the third bookshelf. It seemed pretty empty. He unfolded the letter carefully, his heart pounding with anticipation. The old paper crackled softly as he began to read the words written long ago. Chung Myung looked up, surprised. The letter was from the sect leader. He continued reading, his eyes scanning the ancient script. If anyone was reading this right now, it meant the next generation sect leader had been decided. He turned the page, his expression thoughtful. The sect leader humbly left his words in this letter. The role of the Manhwa sect leader wasn't simply to lead the Manhwa sect. If the reader was already a sect leader, they surely must know this already. The letter went on to say that those who truly lead the Manhwa sect are none other than its own disciples, the children who would grow to carry its legacy. He could almost see the sect leader carefully writing these words, each stroke filled with the weight of responsibility. The sect leader continued, saying that the job of anyone leading the sect was simply to protect and motivate the disciples. They needed to ensure everyone could chase their dreams, nothing less. The letter stated that the Manhwa sect was just the Manhwa sect. It was full of a will and spirit that no one could ever control or lead. Whether it was on the rise or in decline, the Manhwa sect would always be itself, the letter said. It was a promise and a warning all in one. The sect leader's final words were about ensuring the will of the Manhwa sect was passed on to future generations, unchanged. The key to that was fostering those future generations and continuing their legacy. The letter spoke of a great responsibility left behind by the writer, a duty passed down from ancestor to successor. The letter identified the writer as Chung Mun, the 21st sect leader of the great Manhwa sect. Chung Myung continued to read, feeling the weight of those words. He muttered that the guy seemed to like nagging others, even from beyond the grave. Yu Iseol stood near the doorway, quietly observing him. She figured she didn't get much out of this trip, but it should be enough. What really mattered was that she finally had the account books in her hands. She started walking back the way she came. Chung Myung thought that with these, he could bring back Manhwa's stolen businesses. But then he paused. Something didn't feel right to him. Chung Myung looked around the storage room, his eyes narrowing. Something was definitely off about the way this place looked. He stared around, his face showing his confusion. This was strange, really strange. Chung Myung remembered that the Sahyung Chung Moon he knew had terrible OCD. He was someone who kept 2 lamps in his room, directly on his right and left, to keep the symmetry of his room. Chung Myung looked at the 3rd shelf, now almost empty. He wondered how someone like Chung Moon could have left it like this. Chung Myung stared up at the shelf, his eyes widening. Suddenly, a hand reached out and pushed the shelf hard. Chung Myung gritted his teeth and shoved against the shelf, putting his weight into it. There definitely is something special about this shelf. The shelf groaned under the force, wood splintering. Chung Myung finally managed to shove the shelf aside, revealing a hidden room behind it. Dust billowed out as he stepped inside. Chung Myung knew he was right about this door, and immediately, he saw that there was something inside. The room glowed with a golden light, like something out of a fairy tale, and Chung Myung finally got inside. He ended up witnessing something incredible. Piles and piles of golden bars. It was insane. And there were the swords, the most precious swords, all perfectly organized and lined up. There were also gems and secret technique books piled everywhere. Chung Myung spotted a cat's eye stone and couldn't believe his luck. Chung Myung started laughing like a total maniac. He was enjoying every second of this. He shouted that he was finally rich. He was going to make sure to bring the Manhwa sect back to its former glory. It was morning already. Someone noticed the sun coming up. It must have been the start of a delightful day for some people, but Hyunjong couldn't help but resent it. He was staring out at the rising sun, but couldn't bring himself to feel any joy. There were only 5 days remaining until the promised appointment with the pavilion owner Kong. Hyunjong knew that if he failed, the Manhwa sect would be done for. Suddenly, someone yelled out, calling for the sect leader. The shout echoed through the halls, filled with panic. Hyunjong asked Eungum what was going on, but Eungum was so nervous that he could barely get the words out. Eungum said that he would tell him all the details once they got there. He insisted that the sect leader had to go see it for himself right away. It was that important. Hyunjong looked confused and asked where he had to go. He didn't understand why he was being rushed like this. Hyunjong figured that it must be something really important if Eungum was acting this desperate. He told him to lead the way, deciding to trust his judgment. Eungum agreed immediately. They rushed through the forest, pushing past the trees. The wind whistled in their ears as they moved faster and faster. Hyunjong suddenly stopped and looked down the hill. As a result, his eyes went wide with disbelief at the sight below. Hyunjong rushed forward, seeing all the disciples lying on the ground, knocked out. He asked Eungum what the hell had happened to the kids. He recalled they were just doing some extra training this morning. The sound of footsteps echoed through the forest. They were getting closer to their destination, and fast. We're almost there. The sect leader could sense something was wrong. He yelled out, demanding to know where Chung Myung was. Below, the sect leader's face was full of panic. Hyunjong kept shouting, desperate to find the kid. Where are you, Chung Myung? Chung Myung looked back at them, his voice calm. He simply said, I am here. Hyunjong was completely stunned. He started to ask why Chung Myung was standing there, looking worn out. The sect leader demanded to know what the hell had happened to him. Chung Myung insisted that the sect leader take a look at something first, saying it was very important. But Hyunjong wouldn't hear of it, saying that Chung Myung's condition seemed more important. Hyunjong looked at Chung Myung with concern, but his curiosity was getting the better of him. He wondered what could possibly be of such importance. Suddenly, the entire area was filled with a blinding light. The sect leader squinted, trying to figure out what was going on. Hyunjong's eyes widened in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was seeing in front of him. Chung Myung looked back, a wide smile spreading across his face. He couldn't believe what he had just stumbled upon. A treasure chest overflowed with gold bars and ancient books. Chung Myung realized he had discovered this by accident. Hyunjong was absolutely shocked. He stammered, asking how Chung Myung had found this place. He was sweating from exhaustion. Hyunjong quickly told Chung Myung to go back and rest, saying he wouldn't ask any more questions. Chung Myung's shoulders slumped as he tried to catch his breath. He was completely drained. The shiny golden bars seemed to stretch on forever. Chung Myung stared in awe, completely speechless. Hyunjong's eyes widened as he looked at the contents of the chest. He muttered, realizing realizing there was something even more important inside. Lying inside the chest were the account books. Hyunjong realized they were the Hua Prefecture business account books of the great Manhwa sect. Hyunjong slapped his forehead, suddenly understanding the situation. He had almost forgotten about these books. Hyunjong knew that if he carelessly opened the books, they might crumble apart, and he'd be uneasy for the rest of his life. On top of that, there was something else that caught his attention. Hyunjong carefully picked up one of the books. He stammered in disbelief, barely able to comprehend what he was seeing. Hyunjong's eyes went wide as he read the words in the book. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The shock of what he was reading was too much for Hyunjong. He fell backwards, overwhelmed. 2 members of the sect saw Hyunjong fall. They ran towards him immediately, shouting for their sect leader. Hyunjong looked up, dazed. He mumbled something unintelligible. Hyunjong finally managed to get the words out. He announced that these were the 7 Plum Blossoms Sword Technique records. Hyunjong suddenly sat up in his bed. He looked around, clearly disturbed by something. Someone shouted, asking if they had brought the chest with them. He was relieved that the sect leader was awake, and immediately demanded that Hyunyoung, the leader of the Finance and Economy Agency, be brought to Hyunjong. The person stared intently at the book. He seemed shocked by what he was reading. Hyunyoung declared that they were all real, confirming the authenticity of the items. Hyunjong asked if he was sure. The other man confirmed that he was completely sure. He added that he had also secured the verification documents that were under the treasures. Hyunyoung held up the documents, explaining that they were from the government itself. He said that with these, they could not only prove that the account books were real, but also, Hyunyoung continued, saying that they could immediately bring back the businesses of the Taihua Pavilion and the Hua Prefecture, which had originally been under the Manhwa sect. He added that the treasures that came with these documents easily exceeded 100,000 nyangs. Hyunyoung sighed in relief, clearly overcome with emotion. He said that it was a relief and that there was only good news. The room fell silent as everyone took in the news. The implications of this discovery were starting to sink in, and a sense of hope filled the air. Someone thought about that kid, Chung Myung, to think that the decision to accept him would bring them such prosperity. It was unbelievable. Someone said that the kid was the harbinger of fortune in the Manhwa sect. It was a lot of pressure to put on a child, but they weren't wrong so far. More importantly, someone slammed their hands on the table, making a loud noise. It was a sign that a decision was being made. The elder stood up from his chair, turning around. He thought that if the account books were real, he would have to confront them. Hyunjong yelled for them to bring in all personnel related to the Great Manhwa's Hua Prefecture business account books. He looked absolutely furious. A few days had passed since the sect leader had demanded the account books. The story was about to move forward. Someone shouted, complaining about being pushed and warning that he was going to fall. He looked absolutely furious. The man stated that they weren't too far from the Manhwa sect and told everyone to keep moving. He then replied to someone with, "Yes, sir." At the top, one of the guys was thinking that after he got his money, he was never coming back to this mountain. And immediately below, another guy was breathing heavily, looking exhausted. The men wondered why the sect leader had suddenly called them to Manhwa. They questioned if he had already prepared the money. The group made their way up the mountain path, each step bringing them closer to Manhwa. One of the men muttered that 100,000 nyangs wasn't exactly pocket change, highlighting the significant debt at stake. One of the creditors figured that Haegun Jeong was probably calling them to beg for mercy. He didn't think there was any way the sect leader could get that much money in such a short amount of time. Another man speculated that there was no point in dragging things out until the promised date. That was probably why Haegun Jeong was calling them in early, he thought. One of the creditors scoffed, saying that the sect leader made them come and go as he wished just to beg from them. He added that he'd never seen such a shameless debtor. But another man told him to refrain from speaking of him with such harsh words, even though Hyunjong was currently going through financial difficulties. The shop owner Yu looked anxious, wondering if it was possible that they weren't going to get their money back after all. He looked really concerned. The group of people walked up the mountain. One of them pointed out that the fact that someone from the Southern Edge sect came to this area made it obvious that many people were interested in Manhwa's temple. One of them was really excited about the money. He figured that if he got 5,000 nyangs today, like he was supposed to, he wouldn't have to work for the rest of his life. He wouldn't have to keep running his shop. The group gathered at the entrance to the building. They looked nervous as they waited to go inside. The group stood silently. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. They were all clearly nervous about what was about to happen. When the merchants reached the gates, they all felt conflicted about bringing down the Manhwa sect with their own hands. The sect had been the protector of the Hua Prefecture for hundreds of years. If they didn't give in to the sect leader today, the Manhwa sect wouldn't even last 7 more days. Knowing this, they climbed up Mount Hua with heavy hearts. They were there to receive their debt, which had increased to a substantial amount of money over time. Shop owner Yu had a serious look on his face as he walked up the stairs. He seemed determined to get what he was owed. The group continued to walk towards the building. They were about to meet with the sect leader, and the tension was building with every step. A man greeted them with a deep bow. He announced that they had arrived and were expected. The man explained that the sect leader was waiting for them. He asked them to follow him that way, to where Hyunjong was waiting. The sect leader paused for a moment, lost in thought. He seemed to be considering his next words carefully, knowing the weight they carried. The merchants finally arrived at the sect leader's residence, ready to discuss the debt. The air was thick with anticipation, and everyone was eager to hear what he had to say. One of the merchants bowed deeply, showing respect to the sect leader. He announced that they humbly greeted him, signaling the start of the meeting. The sect leader welcomed everyone, thanking them for answering his call and climbing up the mountain. Immediately, one of the merchants replied that it was no problem at all. One of the merchants said that even though they were busy, they could never be busier than the sect leader. He added that it was a given that they were the ones to come visit him. The sect leader chuckled, suggesting they have a cup of tea since they must be worn out from climbing. The merchants were all lined up, bowing low. The sect leader was facing them, listening intently to what they had to say. One of the merchants spoke up, explaining that they were just lowly merchants and wanted to get straight to the point without any extra stuff. He seemed eager to get the meeting underway. Hyunjong listened to the merchant, a slight smile forming on his face. He seemed to be considering their request, his expression thoughtful. The sect leader replied that he understood, saying he might have been a little inconsiderate. He seemed to be adjusting his approach based on their directness. Hyunjong then explained that the real reason he had called them all the way up there was to tell them the Manhwa sect's official position on their business. He was about to lay down the terms. From a distance, the Manhwa sect looked peaceful, but things were not good. Someone explained that they had contacted many people, but they still couldn't find anyone willing to lend them money. Hyunjong sighed heavily. He admitted that he wouldn't be able to repay the debt when it was due. Hyunjong stood silently, listening to all of this. The sect leader's expression was unreadable, but the situation was clearly tense. One of the merchants stepped forward, telling the sect leader that they had already given him more than enough time. He explained that they were merchants who needed to make a living and couldn't afford to wait any longer. The merchant looked directly at Hyunjong. He emphasized that this was precisely why he was bringing all of this up. One of the merchants spoke up, saying that even though they couldn't repay the entire debt, they could at least repay part of it. He hoped that would be enough to satisfy them for now. The merchant continued, wondering if anyone there would be willing to delay the repayment date. He was clearly hoping for someone to show them some mercy. Another one of the merchants pleaded with them to do the Manhwa sect a favor and show them some mercy. He bowed deeply, hoping to sway their decision. The atmosphere in the room was getting weird. Down below, one of the merchants looked nervous and uncertain. The narrator said that the atmosphere had started to flow in a strange direction. Everyone was on edge, waiting to see what would happen next. The group of merchants stood outside, waiting. The person in front of them was thinking hard, trying to figure out what to do next. The person watching thinks to himself, wondering if that's how Hyunjong is handling things. He looked a little surprised, as if he hadn't expected this. He still didn't understand what was going on. The guy looked completely lost in thought. He wondered if Hyunjong was trying to push the merchants into a corner, or if he was just being nice. It could honestly be either one, he thought. But one thing he knew for sure was that Hyunjong wasn't as simple as he looked. The guy seemed deep in thought. The most important thing a sect leader needs is to be calm. The scene then shifts to a building. Even though the Manhwa sect is a place where many Taoists live, martial arts are the base of the sect. So, making smart choices should come naturally, especially for the sect leader. The back of a man's head is shown. Does Hyunjong have what it takes to be a good sect leader? The man stared intensely. Hyunjong explained that he had already said he couldn't give them any more time. He asked them not to misunderstand him. The merchant clarified that he wasn't just talking to pavilion owner Kong. He seemed serious about whatever he was saying. Hyunjong explained that even though the Manhwa sect owes 100,000 nyangs, he owes a unique amount to everyone there. He was trying to be reasonable. Hyunjong paused for a second. He seemed to be thinking about what to say next. Hyunjong then asked if anyone would be kind enough to let them delay the repayment date. The sect leader was trying to appeal to their good nature. The man thought that Hyunjong was resorting to pitiful trickery. He looked annoyed. The man asked if that meant Hyunjong was able to immediately repay those who refused to comply with his request. He seemed to be calling calling Hyunjong's bluff. Hyunjong explained that even though the Manhwa sect has decayed significantly compared to the past, that didn't mean they had nowhere to turn. He added that even though they couldn't prepare the entire 100,000 neongs, they could prepare a portion of it. He was trying to sound confident. Hyunjong then pleaded with them. He promised that in the name of the Manhwa sect, they would make sure to repay the debt of those who were willing to show mercy on them today. He looked desperate. One of the merchants spoke up, questioning if Hyunjong even knew what he was talking about. He asked if it meant that if they delayed the repayment date, he would repay them in the future. The merchant looked skeptical. Hyunjong confirmed that was precisely so. He seemed determined to make it happen. Another merchant spoke up, asking Hyunjong something. He pointed out that it wouldn't be strange for the Manhwa sect to collapse any day soon, and surely he himself and everyone there realized that. He seemed to be doubting the sect's future. One of the merchants pointed out that trusting Hyunjong's words and delaying the repayment date would come with the risk of potentially not receiving their payments. He looked at the others for confirmation. Another merchant chimed in, asking for what reason anyone would comply with his offer. The man seemed to be pressing Hyunjong for a good answer. The merchant stared intently, waiting for a response. He wasn't going to let Hyunjong off the hook easily. Hyunjong didn't say anything for a moment. Looking down, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hyunjong finally spoke, saying that he was asking for them to do it for the name of the Manhwa sect and for its history. He looked up, his eyes filled with determination. One of the merchants grinned, asking if that wasn't enough. He laughed, clearly not impressed by Hyunjong's appeal. Another merchant yelled at Hyunjong, calling him sect leader. He looked absolutely furious. One of the merchants asked if Hyunjong wasn't being a bit too unreasonable. The man looked like he was about to explode with anger. At the same time, the other merchants were yelling at Hyunjong, clearly backing up the first merchant's point. Hyunjong paused, looking down for a moment. He then asked if they were saying that he was being unreasonable. The sect leader's eye twitched, showing his rising anger. Hyunjong said that he would like to answer their question with another question. He was clearly not backing down from this confrontation. Hyunjong asked what the Manhwa sect meant to everyone there. He continued, questioning if the name and history of the Manhwa sect carried any value at all. The sect leader continued, questioning who would dare to treat the name of the Manhwa sect lightly. He pressed on, asking who would dare to dismiss its history. Hyunjong explained that they may have weakened over the years, but the Manhwa sect had always been with the Hwa prefecture this entire time. He added that the Manhwa sect had passed on its energy and spirit over the generations and continuously shared it throughout the entire prefecture. Hyunjong continued, saying that he would like to humbly ask of them something. Meanwhile, one of the merchants looked down, seemingly contemplating something. Hyunjong asked them to reflect on what the Manhwa sect meant to them. The merchants looked at each other, seemingly unsure of what to say. Hyunjong spoke up, saying that he would like to suggest something to everyone there. He looked around, waiting for everyone to pay attention to what he had to say. Hyunjong gestured, directing people to move to one side. He then told everyone that those who were willing to personally delay the repayment date should stand over there. Hyunjong continued, telling everyone that those who were not willing to delay should stay standing where they were. The atmosphere was tense, with everyone unsure of what to do. Hyunjong then warned that everyone was responsible for their own actions. He wanted to make sure everyone understood the risks involved. Hyunjong added, clarifying that those who decided to delay the repayment date would not be protected by the Merchant Alliance. The sect leader emphasized that this was the case even if they ended up not receiving their payments. The speaker told everyone to choose where they wanted to stand. He looked around, waiting for them to make their decisions. The tension in the air was thick as everyone considered their options. The merchants started murmuring among themselves, clearly unsure of what to do. They looked at each other, trying to gauge what the others were thinking. At the same time, another group of merchants also mumbled, hesitant to make a decision. The merchants were still unsure, not knowing what to do. The air was thick with uncertainty. But below, a man smirked, clearly pleased with how things were going. Someone spoke up, saying, "Look at what we have here, sect leader." The speaker seemed amused by the situation. The man opened his arms wide, gesturing to the crowd. He pointed out that no one was willing to personally delay the repayment. The merchant clicked his tongue, clearly disappointed. Shop owner Yu walked away from the group, and immediately, someone asked if that was shop owner Yu. Hyunjong stared intensely. He seemed to be thinking about something. Someone shouted at shop owner Yu, asking what he thought he was doing. The others watched with anticipation. Shop owner Yu asked them not to look at him like that. He admitted that he knew he was doing something stupid, but he had something to say. The sect leader looked on, waiting to hear what he had to say. Pavilion owner Kong told them that he wasn't from the Hwa prefecture. He had a serious look on his face. Since since he didn't have any connection to the Manhwa sect. He said they probably didn't realize something. There was a fire in his eyes. He continued, saying they didn't understand what the Manhwa sect really meant to the Hua prefecture. He looked like he was about to explain. He explained that everyone who grew up in the Hua prefecture grew up hearing stories about the Manhwa sect. The man's expression was serious. He added that they always heard the phrase, "You also need to enter the Manhwa sect and become the world's greatest martial arts master." He seemed to be making a point about the sect's importance. Pavilion owner Kong looked serious, like he was about to drop some truth. His expression was intense, as if he was remembering something important. And even if people realized they weren't good enough to join the Manhwa sect, they still heard stories. The speaker said they kept hearing how the Manhwa sect protected this world. Shop owner Yu suddenly interrupted, asking what they were talking about. He added that he wasn't the only one who grew up hearing those stories. Shop owner Yu explained that it was the same for his father and grandfather. Because of that, he said the Manhwa sect was the pride of the Shanxi province and the Hua prefecture. Shop owner Yu warned that if they left after taking the money, it would be over for them. He said there were many places like Hangzhou City where they could spend their money. Shop owner Yu wondered where he would even go with the money he got. He had lived his whole life in the Hua prefecture. He asked if they were giving up such a large sum of money for something so small. Hyunjong told him he would regret his choice. He seemed confident in his words, like he knew something they didn't. Shop owner Yu admitted that he had only looked forward to getting his money and not having to work ever again. He looked conflicted, like he was having second thoughts. Shop owner Yu was thinking that he must have gone crazy to say such things. He seemed to be struggling with his decision. At the same time, his fist clenched tightly, showing his inner turmoil. Shop owner Yu trailed off, lost in thought. It was clear he was wrestling with something important. Shop owner Yu stepped forward, addressing the group. He said that he already made enough money to live comfortably. He seemed pretty confident in his position. Shop owner Yu continued, making his point clear. He added that even if he didn't get the money, he could just see it as a small regret. The shop owner seemed determined to stand his ground. Shop owner Yu then declared that he would regret causing the Manhwa sect to fall apart. He said he would feel that regret until his dying breath, even if he got a ton of money. The man seemed to be speaking from the heart. Shop owner Yu looked up, his expression firm. He stated that he didn't want to live a life filled with that kind of regret. It was clear that he had made up his mind. Hyunjong smiled slightly, listening to the man's words. He told shop owner Yu to do as he pleased. The sect leader said it wouldn't change anything if just one person decided not to take the money. The man's face was shown in a close-up. He asked who said there was only one person. He seemed to be hinting that more people would refuse to take the money. As he spoke, a group of people walked down the hallway. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the building. They were heading towards where Hyunjong was. The group of people stood together, wearing serious expressions. At the same time, one of the men looked up, a question mark floating above his head, clearly surprised by something. Hyunjong stood tall, his expression unreadable, as he faced the people before him. The sect leader was flanked by two individuals, their faces partially obscured, adding to the tension in the room. Hyunjong closed his eyes, a deep breath escaping his lips. The sect leader seemed to be steeling himself, bracing for whatever was about to happen. The man in green looked at the others and said that he was plenty satisfied with the fact that there were still those who held a meaningful connection to the Manhwa sect. He looked hopeful that they could come to an agreement. Hyunjong called out to Onam to bring it there right away. Onam agreed immediately, acknowledging the sect leader's command. A box filled with books was placed on the ground with a thud. The sound echoed slightly in the room. The books were old and worn, but they were neatly stacked. Someone gasped, realizing what they were looking at. Someone recognized them as the business account books of the Hua prefecture. The man looked shocked and confused. One of the men addressed the crowd and said that the Manhwa sect had been generous to them and their families for many generations. He seemed to be reminding them of their past. The man's expression changed as he accused them of betraying the sect instead of paying what they owed. He looked absolutely furious. The man's face was covered in sweat as he looked utterly terrified. He looked like he was about to have a heart attack. A foot slammed down, emphasizing the threat. The man declared that, according to the account books, the Manhwa sect would be taking over their businesses. He continued, saying that they would also be taking all the wealth they had gained through those businesses, down to the very last coin. The merchants looked stunned as the man walked. One of the men shouted at the sect leader, demanding what he was talking about. The crowd looked on, waiting for an explanation. Another man stepped forward, accusing the sect leader of taking over all the businesses. He said it was just as he had predicted. Another man told the sect leader that his joke had gone too far. He looked serious, not finding any humor in the situation. The Sect leader replied that it was a shame that they thought he would have the time to joke around with them. He looked annoyed by their accusations. Another voice spoke, but the Sect leader cut him off. He slammed his hand down on some papers, looking absolutely furious. The man looked at the account books in his hands. He asked how they could prove that the account books were real. The speaker looked at the group of people. He asked if they were saying that the Manhwa sect had forged the evidence, adding that he was sure the Manhwa sect would never do that. The Sect leader spoke to the man, trying to reason with him. He asked how he could be so sure that he wasn't being tricked by what were presumably fake account books. The man listened to the sect leader's words. He replied that he understood where he was coming from. The sect leader ordered Unam A to bring the leader of the finance and economy agency to him. Unam replied that he would. Sect leader. The man looked closely, thinking about the account books. He said the validity of the account books was something they had to consider. Hyun Young agreed with the man. He said that it was certainly something they had to take into account. Another man chimed in, agreeing with Hyun Young. He added that even the leader of the finance and economy agency agreed, saying it was as expected of pavilion owner Kong. But the man with long hair paused, turning to look back at the group. He seemed to be thinking hard, then said, "However," the man continued, looking down thoughtfully. He explained that since they had expected something like this to happen, Hyun Young raised his hand, explaining that they had already sent half of the account books to the Hua prefectural office to get them appraised. He seemed confident that this would solve the problem, but another man looked absolutely furious. He shouted that this was insane, clearly not happy with the situation. The realization hit everyone at once. They had been tricked, and it was clear this was a big problem. The text explained that if the government soldiers started taking over the businesses while they were away, they wouldn't be able to stop it. As a result, the merchants would lose everything. The text revealed the sect leader's plan. Calling them there was a trick to make them leave the market. The crowd realized they had fallen into a trap and looked worried about what would happen next. The text emphasized that 2 days was more than enough time to check the account books that they had sent away. It was a race against time. The man realized they had only sent half the books, and the ones in the chest must have already been checked. He looked shocked by this realization. The text stated that the government soldiers were waiting for them to leave so they could take over the businesses. The man looked absolutely furious as he realized the implications. Someone shouted for the SEC leader, clearly upset about everything. The SECT leader immediately yelled back, telling the man to lower his voice. He said that the man had no right to raise his voice at him. The SECT leader addressed the crowd, saying that true friendship comes from helping each other when they're in need. He looked confident as he spoke to the crowd. The men looked worried, and the SEC leader continued. He stated that there was no need to help those who had betrayed them when they needed help. The men looked even more nervous after hearing that. The SECT leader told them to head back immediately. He added that everything would be over once they arrived in the Hua prefecture. There was a coldness in his tone. The sect leader continued, saying that if they were to do things how they were supposed to be done, they would have taken over everything they owned. But he said, considering the hard work they had put in until now, he would allow them to take a cartload of their wealth with them. He seemed to be enjoying this. The man said that he would never forget this, and immediately he turned and walked away, his steps heavy with anger. The men started walking away, clearly upset. At the same time, a group of people looked downward, their expressions unreadable. The sect leader's words hung in the air, and immediately a man looked up, listening intently. The sect leader continued, saying that nothing changed the fact that their businesses belonged to the Manhwa sect, and naturally, it would return to their possession. Hearing this, the man in the doorway seemed to be listening carefully. The SECT leader said that he would permit everyone there to continue running their businesses and taking the profit for themselves. He looked confident as he made the offer. The SECT leader added that he would like to discuss how things should be run in order to benefit both parties, inviting them to come inside. The people looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Shop owner Yu was thinking that even though he was in a better position than those who sided with pavilion owner Kong, he still got demoted from a shop owner to a stand-in owner in an instant. He seemed really upset about it. He sighed, wondering what his grandfather had done. As he pondered, the scene shifted to a distant landscape. up. Meanwhile, a man suddenly shouted, asking what was going on and who told Hyunjong that he could give away a cartload of their wealth. He looked absolutely furious. He continued yelling, asking who Hyunjong thought he was to give away a portion of the Manhwa sect's wealth. The man's anger was palpable. At the top, people were pulling carts looking normal. However, down below, Hyunjong looked furious. The soldiers explained that after they climbed down Manhwa, all of the businesses were taken over by the government soldiers. They added that if it wasn't for the sect leader's request, they would have lost everything. A man looked up, yelling Pavilion Owner Kong's name. He regretted listening to that scumbag. Another man yelled Pavilion Owner Kong's name. He asked what they were supposed to do now. The man demanded that Pavilion Owner Kong say something. He reminded Kong that he had told them to trust him. At the same time, a cartwheel was shown. The man looked furious and asked if he was being blamed for everything. He seemed ready to explode. The man denied blaming him for anything. He stammered, trying to explain himself, and immediately, someone slammed a stick on the ground, making everyone jump. The man in red told everyone there was no need to get worked up. He said they would only be in this position temporarily. He then asked how those account books could possibly be real. The man yelled that those were fakes. He insisted that the sect leader had forged them. One of the guys pointed out that the prefectural office had validated them. He added that he had taken a peek at the contents, and they all seemed legit. The man in the red robe was clearly upset. He said they probably set the whole thing up with the representative from the prefecture. He looked like he was about to explode with anger. The man's face was red with fury. He told everyone to head to Luoyang City for now. He looked determined to take action. The man clenched his fist tightly, veins popping out. He declared that if they were using authorities to push them down, they would have to oppose them with even bigger authorities. He was clearly not backing down. The man scoffed, calling it garbage. He was clearly frustrated with the situation. Everyone else looked just as annoyed. Meanwhile, someone dressed in all black was lurking in the forest. The figure seemed to be watching and listening carefully. The air was thick with tension. The man in the red robe asked if the figure in black was the one who had been speaking. He was interrupted by someone coughing nearby. The coughing man wanted to know who else was there. The coughing got worse. The guy in charge pointed out that the person was wearing a thief's costume in broad daylight. He wondered if the bent back meant he was an old man. The man in the red robe warned the thief that he should just leave if he was aiming for their wealth, or he would lose his life for nothing. He seemed serious about the threat. The thief asked if he was talking about his wealth. The thief yelled that he wasn't trying to steal someone else's wealth. He was just trying to get back his own. He sounded absolutely furious. The man in the red robe looked confused by this statement. He seemed to be thinking about what the thief had just said. The man in the thief's costume asked if they were from the Manhwa sect. He looked like he was waiting for an answer. The thief grinned, saying that it was good timing because now he could get revenge on them. He seemed excited about the prospect. Suddenly, a group of men in black thief costumes charged forward. They looked like they were ready for a fight. The eyes of one of the men narrowed as they prepared to attack, and immediately, the group swarmed the wagon, swords raised. One of the men in black looked down at his target. His eyes were filled with a cold fury. The thief moved with incredible speed. The air cracked as he swung his weapon. The thief lunged forward, sword raised. The other man barely managed to block the attack. The thief didn't give him any room to breathe, and immediately, he followed up with a brutal punch. The force of the blow was intense. It sent shockwaves through the air. The other thieves joined in the attack all at once. Beams of light flashed as they tried to overwhelm their target. The thief moved with incredible speed. He was ready to attack. At the same time, the other man stood his ground, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The thief stood over the bodies of his defeated opponents. He warned that they didn't realize what they were up against. The man with the beard spoke with a menacing tone. He said that no one had ever defied him and lived to tell the tale. The man started sweating, realizing the strength of his opponent. He ordered his useless subordinates to back off. They were groaning on the ground. The man wondered where someone like the thief had been all this time. He added that if he had stepped in earlier, the Manhwa sect wouldn't have fallen so far. The man stepped forward, ready to fight. He warned that the thief had picked the wrong time to interfere. The thief was ready to fight. He declared that he would kill the man and send his body back to the Manhwa sect as a warning. The man with the glowing hands spoke with confidence. He said that the sect leader would be sad to hear that someone like the thief died by his hands. The man shouted, telling the thief to prepare himself. He looked absolutely furious. The thief realized that the man had been hiding his true power. He knew that there was no way someone who just owned an inn could be this strong. He was impressed. The man spoke to the thief with a smirk. He warned that he wouldn't beat up the thief's mouth too badly. He looked confident, and immediately, the thief was sent flying through the air. The force of the blow was so strong that it looked like he was launched from a cannon. The man added that he needed the thief to be able to speak at least. He was clearly planning something.